In spite of the steady accumulation of detailed knowledge, how the human brain works is still profoundly mysterious. The ultimate goal of neuroscience is to learn how the brain gives rise to human intelligence and what it means to be intelligent. Understanding how the brain works is considered one of humanity's greatest challenges.
I got into this field because I just was curious as to who I am. How do I think? What's going on in my head when I'm thinking? What does it mean to know something? I can ask what it means for me to know something independent of how I learned it from you or from someone else or from society. What does it mean for me to know that I have a model of you in my head? What does it mean to know I know what this microphone does and how it works physically, even when I can't see it right now? How do I know that? What does it mean? How do the neurons do that at the fundamental level of neurons and synapses and so on? Those are really fascinating questions.
The neuroscientist Francis Crick observed that scientists have been collecting data on the brain for decades. They knew a lot about the workings of the brain, but they hadn't converged on any meaningful theory of how the brain worked. How intelligence emerges from low-level cells in your head is still a profound mystery. To be intelligent, the brain has to learn a great many things about the world. To understand how the brain creates intelligence, we need to figure out how the brain learns a model of the world and everything in it. Jeff Hawkins thinks that the reality we perceive is a kind of simulation, a hallucination, a confabulation. He thinks that our brains are a model of reality based on thousands of information streams originating in the senses in our body. Critically, Hawkins doesn't think that there's only one model, but rather thousands. Jeff has just released his new book, 1,000 Brains, A Theory of Intelligence. It's an inspiring and well-written book, and I really hope after watching this show, you'll be inspired to read it too. Now, Jeff is a sub-symbolist. He thinks that our knowledge is sliced and distributed over the substrate of synapses in our brain, but similarly that our simulated models of the world are also distributed over hundreds and thousands of cortical columns. This means that when we recognize a dog, there's a society of cortical columns all independently predicting that the dog is there and mutually calibrating after a consensus is reached. Now, Jeff Hawkins is a materialist. He thinks that despite appearances to the contrary, mental states are just physical states, and that the latter emerges from the former. There's no inception, no ghost in the machine, no Cartesian theatre.
If I had to summarize it into one big idea, is that we think of the brain, the neocortex, as learning this model of the world. But what we learned is actually there's tens of thousands of independent modeling systems going on. And so each, what we call a column in the cortex, there's about 150,000 of them, is a complete modeling system. So it's a collective intelligence in your head in some sense. So the 1,000 Brains theory says, well, where do I have knowledge about, this coffee cup, or where's the model of this cell phone? It's not in one place. It's in thousands of separate models that are complementary, and they communicate with each other through voting.
Hawkins says that the neocortex is the outermost and most recently evolved layer of the mammalian brain, a bit like a wrinkly napkin, which wraps around the old brain. It occupies about 70% of the volume of your brain, and it's responsible for all aspects of your intelligence. That is to say, your sense of vision, touch, hearing, language in all its forms, and even abstract thinking, such as mathematics and philosophy. The neocortex is surprisingly different to other parts of the brain. It has no visually obvious divisions. The anatomical organization is strikingly similar. Nevertheless, different parts of the neocortex still perform different functions, like vision or hearing, for example. The complex circuitry of the neocortex looks remarkably alike in visual regions and language regions and even touch regions. It looks similar across species, such as rats, cats, and humans, and the variations between regions are relatively small compared to their similarities. Now, Hawkins argues that the complexity of the brain is in the content of its connections and its wiring, which is an emergent property of a simple learning algorithm. I mean, look at the OpenAI microscope, their tool for visualizing trained convolutional neural networks as an example. The learning algorithm is simple, but all of this beautiful complexity emerges as a result of training. Even after this type of visualization, it's not really understandable by us humans. It's possible that any successful knowledge representational substrate for some domains of data may never be understandable by humans. Now, the neocortex is arguably one of the main organs of intelligence. It gives us sensory perception, motor control, and abstract thought. The key attributes it has are its ability to learn continuously, learn rapidly, its power efficiency, and its flexibility, which is to say its ability to learn diverse and novel tasks. Now, Hawkins argues that the neocortex learns a model of the world, that each cortical column is a complete sensory motor modeling system. He thinks that cortical columns use reference frames to store knowledge and generate behavior. Our brains learn about the outside world by processing our sensory inputs and movements. The neocortex anticipates the sensory results of movement. When we touch objects or observe the world around us, our brain receives a sensory motor sequence of information. When moving our fingers over familiar objects, we quickly notice discrepancies, suggesting we make tactile predictions that are specific to particular objects. Hawkins believes that the prediction of sensory stimuli after movements is the fundamental primitive of cognition. The brain does not just memorize the sensory information, as this would become quickly intractable. Instead, Hawkins claims that evolution repurposed the ancient systems that evolved to model spatial relationships such as grid and place cells. It generalized those systems to model abstract concepts in abstract spaces. In this system, thinking and reasoning becomes a kind of traversal through a complex topology of relationships in the brain, analogous to the traversal of a physical space. The whole cortical sheet is made of collections of primitive columnar units called mini-columns. Each cortical area is a collection of millions of cortical mini-columns. These mini-columns are organized in about 6 layers, with specific types of neurons and connection patterns in each layer. Neighboring mini-columns have the same receptive field, so they have the same inputs from other cortical areas, and these mini-columns form complete, fundamental, and primitive units known as macro-columns, or as Hawkins calls them, cortical columns. Now, pyramidal neurons are the typical excitatory neurons in the neocortex. Their name comes from the triangular shape of their cell body. The dendrites of each pyramidal neuron connect to tens of thousands of excitatory synapses, equally split from local and remote sources. The neurons can look significantly different in their connection arrangements depending on which neocortex layer they're situated in. The thalamus is the main input and output subcortical structure to the neocortex. It could be viewed as the 7th layer of the neocortex. It primarily sends sensory or pre-processed information into layer 4 of the neocortex. Moreover, columns in the neocortex learn to model whatever systems are wired to them. Columns wired to the ear, for example, learn to process sound. Columns wired to the retina rods and cones learn to process images. The neocortex can retain remarkable plasticity, even later into life. Perhaps the most striking examples are those of post-injury plasticity, where the brains overcome injury by rewiring remaining neurons to regain some or even full functionality. The cortical regions are densely interconnected with many feedback and feed-forward skip connections across the hierarchy, and all functional areas in the neocortex are bidirectionally connected with other brain structures, but their main inputs and outputs come from other cortical areas via long-distance connections. All cortical regions are densely connected, but there's some apparent asymmetry and even hierarchy detectable in the overall structure. Sensory areas tend to be lower in the hierarchy than associative or motor areas, for example, and bottom-up information flows are known as feed-forward, and top-down connections are known as feedback connections. What should be pretty clear from looking at this structure is that there's no blank slate. There's a very clear cognitive architecture, and much of this high-level structure is there from birth. There are many skip connections, a high level of recurrence with many feedback loops, and the process is highly distributed. At this point, I want to draw your attention to a paper published last year by psychologist Joseph Cesario. It was titled, "Your Brain is Not a Tiny Onion with a Reptile Inside." Joseph pointed out several misunderstandings of nervous system evolution, which he says stems from the work of Paul MacLean, who in the 1940s began to study the brain region, which he called the limbic system. MacLean later proposed that humans possess a so-called Triune Brain, consisting of 3 large divisions that evolve sequentially. The oldest, the reptilian brain, controls basic functions such as movement and breathing. Next, the limbic system, which controls emotional responses. And finally, the cerebral cortex, which pretty much means the neocortex, but he thought that controlled language and reasoning. Joseph said that MacLean's ideas were already understood to be incorrect by the time he published his 1990 book. Since the 1970s, many in developmental neuroscience thought that the ideas from MacLean were a myth. Due to its longevity, the Triune Brain idea has been called by neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett as one of the most successful and widespread errors in all of science. Joseph pointed out that the problem with this view is a simple conception of evolution being arranged sequentially from the simplest to the most complex organisms. This view implies that anatomical evolution proceeds in the same fashion as geological strata, with new layers adding on top of existing ones. Instead, most evolutionary change consists of transforming existing parts. Joseph says that the neocortex is not an evolutionary novelty unique to humans or primates or mammals. All vertebrates possess structures evolutionarily related to our cortex. Joseph concluded that these ideas are consistent with traditional views of human nature as rationality, battling emotion, the tripartite Platonic soul, Freudian psychodynamics, and religious approaches to humanity. It's also a simple idea that can be distilled and communicated to a lay audience. Look, I'm not suggesting for a second that Hawkins subscribes to the idea of a triune brain, but I think it's possible to get this impression reading his book, which is why I wanted to bring this up.
It turns out it's very tricky to get neurons to do this, to build a map of an environment. And so we now know there's these famous studies that's still very active about place cells and grid cells and these other types of cells in the older parts of the brain and how they build these maps of the world. And it's really clever. It's obviously been under a lot of evolutionary pressure over a long period of time to get good at this. So animals know where they are. What we think has happened, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest this, is that mechanism we learned to map like a space was repackaged. The same type of neurons was repackaged into a more compact form, and that became the cortical column.
In 1972, John O'Keefe discovered the first component of an internal GPS system in the brain. He discovered place cells in the hippocampus, which activate when a rat is situated in specific locations in a room. More than 3 decades later, in 2005, May Britt and Edward Moser discovered another key component of the brain's positioning system, grid cells, which represented a coordinate system which allowed for precise positioning and pathfinding. These discoveries solved a problem that has occupied philosophers and scientists for centuries: how the brain creates a map of the complex world around us and how we navigate our way through it. What's intriguing about the brain solution is that it seems to create multiple hexagonal grids with slightly different orientations and scales. Because these grids are orientated and scaled differently, each point in space activates a unique combination of grid cells. In other words, the brain encodes locations using bits in a sparse distributed representation. Jeff thinks that sparse representations are crucial to the success of the human brain and should guide our construction of artificial intelligence. What's intriguing about the brain solution is that it seems to create multiple hexagonal grids with slightly different orientations and scales. Because these grids are orientated and scaled differently, each point in space becomes a unique combination of grid cells. In other words, the brain encodes these cells using a sparse distributed representation. Jeff thinks that such sparse representations are crucial to the success of the human brain and should guide our construction of artificial intelligence.
if you're going to build a model of a house in a computer, they have a reference frame. And you can think of a reference frame like Cartesian coordinates, like X, Y, and Z axes. So I can say, oh, I'm going to design a house. I can say, well, the front door is at this location, X, Y, Z, and the roof is at this location, X, Y, Z, and so on. That's the type of reference frame. So it turns out, for you to make a prediction, and I walk you through the thought experiment in the book where I was predicting what my finger was going to feel when I touched the coffee cup. It was a ceramic coffee cup, but this one will do. And what I realized is that to make a prediction what my finger is going to feel, like it's going to feel different than this, which will feel different if I touch the hole or this thing on the bottom. Make that prediction, the cortex needs to know where the finger is, the tip of the finger, relative to the coffee cup. And exactly relative to the coffee cup. And to do that, I have to have a reference frame for the coffee cup.
Jeff says that after many years of thinking about the function of the neocortex, he deduced that it must store everything that we know, all of our knowledge, right, using something called a reference frame. But what exactly does Jeff mean by a reference frame? Well, consider a paper map as an analogy. A map is a type of model, right? So a map of a town is a model of a town, and the grid lines, such as the latitude and longitude lines, are a type of reference frame. A map's grid lines is its reference frame. So they provide a structure of the map. A reference frame tells you where things are located relative to everything else, and it can tell you how to achieve goals, such as how to go from one location to another location. Now, Jeff realized that the brain's model of the world is built using map-like reference frames. Not one reference frame, but hundreds of thousands of them. Jeff thinks that most of the cells in your neocortex are dedicated to creating and manipulating reference frames, which the brain uses to plan and think. Our brain's knowledge representation is a simulation of reality, and this applies in concept space as well as physical space, as was the case with grid and place cells in other parts of your brain. So Jeff now thinks that the way we think is analogous to how we navigate spaces. He says that the similarity of circuitry observed in all cortical regions is strong evidence that even high-level cognitive tasks are learned and represented in a location-based framework. To be an expert in any domain requires having a good reference frame, a good map. Two people observing the same physical object will likely end up with similar maps. For example, it's hard to imagine how the brains of two people observing the same chair would arrange its features differently. Jeff said in his book that being an expert is mostly about finding the reference frame to arrange facts and observations. I mean, Albert Einstein, for example, started with the same facts as his contemporaries. However, he found a better way to arrange them, a better reference frame that permitted him to see analogies and make predictions that were surprising. What's most fascinating about Einstein's discoveries relating to special relativity is that the reference frame he used to make them were everyday objects, right? He thought about trains and people and flashlights. He started with the empirical observations of scientists, such as the absolute speed of light, and then used everyday reference frames to deduce the equations of special relativity. Because of this, almost anyone can follow his logic and understand how he made the discoveries. In contrast, Einstein's general theory of relativity required reference frames based on mathematical concepts called field equations, which are not easily related to everyday objects. Einstein found this much harder to understand, as does pretty much everyone else. Jeff Hawkins is one of the ultimate gentleman scientists of our age. His first major project was Palm Computing, which is a company that he founded. He invented the Palm Pilot in the mid-1990s, and despite his incredible success in the nascent mobile computing industry, his heart was never in it. His passion was always for theoretical neuroscience. He knew the biggest prize was understanding human intelligence, and then using that knowledge to create human-level machine intelligence. So in 2005, he co-founded Numenta in Redwood City in California. Numenta is a machine intelligence company that has developed a cohesive theory, core software technology, and applications based on the principles of the neocortex. Its dual mission is to understand how the brain works and to apply those principles of real intelligence to create intelligent machines. Neuroscientists were publishing thousands of papers a year covering every single detail of the brain, but there was a lack of systemic theories that tied all of those details together. Numenta decided to first focus on understanding a single cortical column, right? They knew that cortical columns were doing something physically complex and therefore must be doing something complex. Now, last week we had Ben Goertzel on the show, and he was convinced that artificial general intelligence must be a hybrid of many underlying algorithms, not a single learning algorithm. Jeff Hawkins doesn't agree. Hawkins thinks that all the magic of intelligence could emerge from a single cortical learning algorithm. Andrew Ng said that as a young professor, and after he read Hawkins' first book on intelligence, he also became convinced that a simple scaled-up learning algorithm could reach artificial general intelligence. Now, what does seem to really distinguish Hawkins' ideas is that intelligence must emerge from diverse and strongly multimodal inputs. Perhaps that intelligence is somehow emergent from the nature of physical embodiment. Now, Jeff argues that we're the first species on Earth to know the age and the size of the universe. He thinks that humans are the first species to be known by their knowledge and not by their genes.
That's the beauty of this discovery that this guy, Vernon Mountcastle, made many, many years ago, which is that there's a single cortical algorithm underlying everything we're doing.
The Mindful Brain is a small book. It's about 100 pages long and published in 1978, and it contains 2 essays about the brain from 2 prominent scientists. One was written by Vernon Mountcastle, a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins University. Now, Jeff Hawkins cites Mountcastle as being one of his biggest inspirations. Jeff says that it remains one of the most iconic and important essays ever written about the brain. Mountcastle proposed a new way of thinking about the brain that is elegant, a hallmark of great theories, but it's also kind of surprising, and it continues to polarize the neuroscience community. Now, Mountcastle noted that the brain grew really large by adding new brain parts on top of old brain parts. The older parts control more primitive behaviors, while the newer parts create more sophisticated ones. However, Mountcastle goes on to say that while much of the brain got bigger by adding new parts on top of old parts, that's not how the neocortex grew to occupy 70% of our brain. The neocortex got big by making copies of the same basic thing, the same circuit. He says that every single part of the neocortex is the same basic circuit. Different parts of the neocortex are different, not in their intrinsic function, but rather in what they are connected to. The implications of this are huge. If we understand how one part of the neocortex works, we understand how it all works, and how all aspects of intelligence can emerge from a single cortical algorithm. Mountcastle pointed out that the neocortex grew really quickly given the short evolutionary time. Now, Darwin's big idea is that the diversity of life emerged from a single algorithm. Similarly, Mountcastle proposed that the diversity of intelligence also emerged from a single basic algorithm. The difference is that Darwin knew what the algorithm was: random variation and natural selection. Darwin didn't know where the algorithm was in the body. The discovery of DNA came much later. Mountcastle knew where the algorithm resided, but not what it did. Mountcastle said that there's about 150,000 cortical columns in the neocortex, a bit like 150,000 little pieces of spaghetti stacked next to each other. Scientists knew that these columns existed because they all respond to different sensory inputs, be it from a patch of skin or a signal from the retina, but the columns are wired to different sensory inputs from the body. There's a wonderful anecdote in Jeff's book about the last time he met Mountcastle. Jeff gave a speech at Johns Hopkins University, and at the end of the day, he met with Mountcastle and the dean of the department. The time had come for him to leave, and Jeff had a flight to catch, so they said their goodbyes, and the car was waiting for Jeff outside. As Jeff walked through the office door, Mountcastle intercepted him. He put his hand on Jeff's shoulder and said, in a "here is some advice for you" kind of tone of voice, "You should stop talking about hierarchy. It doesn't really exist." Jeff was stunned. Mountcastle was one of the foremost experts on the neocortex, and he was telling Jeff that one of its largest and most well-documented features didn't exist. Jeff was surprised, right? It was as if Francis Crick had said to him, "Oh, that DNA molecule, it doesn't really encode your genes." So Jeff didn't know how to respond. He just said nothing. As Jeff sat in the car on his way to the airport, he tried to make sense of those parting words. Today, Jeff's understanding of hierarchy in the neocortex has changed dramatically. It's much less hierarchical than he previously thought. Did Vernon Mountcastle know this back then? Did he have a theoretical basis for saying that hierarchy didn't really exist? Was he thinking about the experimental results that Jeff didn't know about? He died in 2015, and Jeff will never be able to ask him. After his death, Jeff took it upon himself to reread many of his books and papers. His thinking and writing are always very insightful. His 1998 Perceptual Neuroscience, The Cerebral Cortex, is a physically beautiful book and remains one of Jeff's favourites about the brain. When Jeff thinks back on that day, he really laments, and he kind of wished that he would have chanced missing his flight for that last opportunity to talk with Mountcastle further. Even now, he wishes he could talk to Mountcastle about his current ideas. He'd like to believe that Mountcastle would have enjoyed the Thousand Brains theory of intelligence.
So if you have many brains, who are you then?
So it's interesting. We have a singular perception, right? We think, oh, I'm just here, I'm looking at you. But it's composed of all these things. There's sounds, and there's vision, and there's touch, and all kinds of inputs. Yet we have the singular perception. And what the Thousand Brains theory says, we have these models that are visual models, we have models that are auditory models that tactile models, and so on. But they vote. And so in the cortex, you can think about these columns as like little grains of rice, 150,000 of them stacked next to each other. And each one is its own little modeling system. But they have these long-range connections that go between them. And we call those voting connections, or voting neurons. And so the different columns try to reach a consensus. Like, what am I looking at? Okay, each one has some ambiguity, but they come to a consensus. Oh, there's a water bottle I'm looking at. We are only consciously able to perceive the voting.
Today, the most common way of thinking about the neocortex is a bit like a flow chart, right? Information from the senses is just processed sequentially, step by step, as it passes from one region to the next. In this notion, every step of neuroprocessing refines a representation from the low level to the high level, incrementally. Scientists refer to this as a hierarchy of feature detectors. But as Jeff points out, even basic study of how the brain works will tell you that cognition is an interactive process, right, depending on movement. For example, to learn what a new object looks like, we hold it in our hand and we rotate it this way and that way, and we see what it looks like from different angles. And once learned, we're able to recognize entire objects from the touch of a single finger or a fleeting glimpse of a small part of the object. Jeff's proposal of reference frames and cortical columns suggests a different way of thinking about how the neocortex works, thinking of cortical columns as cognitive primitives, even in low-level sensory regions, that are capable of learning and recognizing complete objects. Jeff's theory explains how a mouse, with a mostly one-level visual system, can see and recognize objects in the world. But where is the knowledge stored in the brain? Jeff thinks that our knowledge of objects are distributed over many cortical columns. So when I pick up a pen, there isn't a single model of this pen, but rather thousands. I have visual models, I have sensory models, I have auditory models, and everything created in between, right? From a rich topology of reference frames, binding them all together. And every cortical column models hundreds, if not thousands, of complete objects at multiple scales. The long-range connections between the columns and the regions of the neocortex communicate at the level of classified objects, not features. Jeff thinks that his theory solves the age-old binding problem in artificial intelligence, which is the challenge of mapping sensory input to discrete mental categories, and how these discrete categories can be combined into a single lived experience. Jeff thinks that the binding problem is a side effect of a flawed assumption that the connection topology of the brain is convergent rather than divergent. The solution to the binding problem is that your cortical columns vote. Your perception is the consensus which is reached from the columns voting on what they recognize. The voting works across sensory modalities. When you grasp an object in your hand, Jeff believes that the tactile columns representing your fingers share another piece of information, their relative position to each other, which makes it even easier to figure out what they're touching. The brain wants to reach a consensus. Now, in Jeff's book, he shows an example of an image, which can appear as either a vase or two faces. In examples like this, the columns can't decide which is the correct object because it's ambiguous. It's as if they have two maps for two different towns, but the maps, at least in some areas, are identical. Vars Town and Faces Town, they're just too similar. So the voting layer wants to reach a consensus, but it doesn't permit two objects to be the same simultaneously, so you have to pick one possibility. You can perceive faces or a vase, but not both at the same time, and the process of cognition allows us to move between the alternatives, to reason interactively over time. In his book, Jeff makes the powerful argument that thinking is simply traversing a topology of reference and displacement frames in your brain. Jeff thinks that this reasoning as movement evolved to extend the physical world of spaces and time to our worlds of abstract thought. The succession of thoughts that we experience when thinking is analogous to the succession of sensations we experience when moving our finger over an object or walking around a town. Perhaps the reason why Albert Einstein was so smart was because of the unique topology of reference frames in his brain. His information architecture, if you will, must have been arranged as a function of his life experiences as well as his biology. Traversing his brain topology allowed him to make powerful abstract inferences that other people couldn't make. For him, it must have felt a bit like the Borg traversing their wormhole network in the Delta Quadrant, for those of you who are fans of Star Trek Voyager. Jeff says that learning conceptual knowledge can be difficult. If I give you 10 historical events related to democracy, how should you arrange them in your brain? One teacher might show you the events arranged on a timeline, in a one-dimensional reference frame. It's useful for assigning the temporal order of the events and which events might be causally related by temporal proximity, but another teacher might arrange the same historical events geographically on a map of the world. Timelines and geography are both valid ways of organizing historical events, yet they lead to different ways of thinking about history. They might lead to different conclusions and different predictions. The best structure for learning about democracy might even require an entirely different map, a map with multiple abstract dimensions that correspond to fairness or rights, for example. So what does the Thousand Brains theory tell us about machine intelligence? Intelligent machines need to learn a model of the world. Inference, prediction, planning, and motor behavior are all based on this model. The model is distributed among many nearly identical units that vote to reach consensus. This gives us robust prediction, it scales well, and it works with any kind of sensor array and modality, and voting solves the binding problem. In each unit, knowledge is stored in a reference frame and is learned via sensory-motor interaction. This means that we can learn unsupervised, fast, and the motor behavior is integrated.
This is Matthew Taylor from Numenta.
This place looks really familiar, but I can't remember how I got here. It's almost like someone severed all of the distal connections between the pyramidal neurons in my neocortex.
Many years ago, Numenta used to refer to their overarching theory as HTM theory, but now they use the terminology Thousand Brains. The HTM, or Hierarchical Temporal Memory Algorithm, was a particular implementation of the early ideas of the Thousand Brains theory. The original guiding principles of HTM were that it was a sequence memory algorithm. Numenta thinks that every neuron in your brain is learning a pattern of sequences. It's needed to support continual learning, and critically, it wasn't an artificial neural network, which they argued were not biologically inspired, or at least not in their popular configuration at the time. The core data structure of the algorithm was called an SDR, or a sparse distributed representation. This was a large bit mask. Think of it as a large ordered collection of ones and zeros. The representation is sparse, which means that it typically only contains about 1% of ones instead of zeros, and the values represented the state of neurons in different regions of your neocortex. So Numenta really leans into this idea of sparsity in the brain and its necessity to build any intelligent system. The reason why sparsity is so powerful is that there are factorially many permutations of values. I mean, for example, there are about 175 million values if you had 4 on bits in an SDR of length 256, right? Because it's 256 choose 4. So this means that the possibility of getting false positives is negligibly small. It's also space efficient because those 4 bits, which could represent 175 million things, could be stored in a 32-bit array, right, which is 4 times 8 bits. The notion of similarity between these SDRs is their intersection or their Hamming distance, and again, the really clever thing is just how robust these representations are to noise. You could add about 33% of random noise to both of the SDRs, and it would barely affect the overlap metric. You can also union the SDRs together, and not much information about the patterns would be lost in the mix. So the HTM algorithm needed encoders to take any data structure and represent it as a sparse distributed representation. Encoding the information into an SDR is an important consideration for HTM, much as it is with any other machine learning model. But I was really excited, when I learned about HTM because it seemed so audacious.
And each column has a connection to this input space, and it has a receptive field. So each column is connected to different bits in the input space, and these are proximal dendritic connections, feed forward input into the system. And each one of the cells within the column shares that receptive field through its proximal connection. We also have these other connections between cells within the structure. And here's a third cell with another 4 synapses on its segment. These are distal connections. So the cell body, or the soma, has got different areas of receptivity. The feed-forward proximal input comes from below, and the contextual information, or the distal connections, come laterally from other cells within the structure. We're comparing a biological neuron to the HTM neuron in software that we're creating. We have the feed-forward input, which is the proximal dendritic input from the input space in both sides, and then the distal input from lateral connections to other cells within the space for context. Now, this HTM neuron is showing that there's feed-forward input, but it's also showing that it can have one or many distal connections. These are distal segments. Each one of these segments could potentially have one or many synapses or connections to other cells within the HTM structure. Each one of those cells may be in an on or an off state. So at any time, if a cell wants to decide whether it's going to go into a predictive state or not, it can look at all of its segments and its connections across all of their synapses. And if any one of those, summed across all the synapses, breach some threshold, which is configurable, then that cell goes into a predictive state based upon its connections, its contextual connections to the other cells within the structure. So what I'm doing is I'm feeding in a 4-note sequence and then resetting and restarting the sequence over. So every time it sees F sharp, the first note in the sequence, it's seeing it without any context. Nothing came before it. So the algorithm goes and looks into every cell in every active column. Only cells within active columns become activated because these activations are completely driven by the proximal segments to the input space. There is only one segment on the cell because it's one color, it's this magenta color, and all of the cells that it's connected to are active in the current time step. That's why it's predictive, because it looked at its segment and it summed up all the synapses, and they were all 1 apparently, and that breached its threshold to become predictive. So it is in a predictive state.
I've never seen another machine learning algorithm quite like it. Almost all of them are continuous rather than discrete. And even the discrete ones, like decision trees, they still assume an ordinal value on the dimensions. HTM takes it one step further. Its representations are also distributed over the features. The only encoding rules of SDRs were that semantically similar data should have a significant overlap on the SDRs. The encoder should be deterministic, and the output should have a fixed dimensionality, and the sparsity level should be similar across the input domain. Now, the thing that was missing to some extent from HTM was the notion of representation learning like we have in neural networks. You have to do it all yourself in the encoder, which is probably the main reason why HTM never took off for unstructured data problems. The reason why CNNs dominated computer vision was because it learned representations that were better than any handcrafted representations. The locality prior and the weight sharing and the stochastic gradient descent made it computationally tractable. The HTM neuron was inspired by pyramidal neurons in the neocortex. A neuron is receiving SDRs from distal apical dendrites higher up in the hierarchy, and from basal dendrites from the same region of the hierarchy, and also from proximal dendrites from lower level of the hierarchy, or some sensory input, which represented the classical receptive field of a neuron. Now, all of these neurons are receiving a stream of SDRs, and they're figuring out when to fire and turn on their on bit, or when they should go into a predictive state, which can tell other neurons when to fire. Right from the very beginning, Numenta knew that real neurons are not simple point neurons. The synapses on active dendrites detect dozens of sparse contextual patterns and can learn complex temporal sequences. Active dendrites enable flexible context integration in the layers of neurons.
There are two primary phases of the temporal memory algorithm. The first is to identify which cells within active columns will become active on this time step. The second phase, once those activations have been identified, is to choose a set of cells to put into a predictive state. This means that these cells will be primed to fire on the next time step.
HTM implemented dendrite branch-specific plasticity, so if a cell becomes active and there's a prediction, it reinforces that dendritic segment. If there is no prediction, it grows the connections by subsampling the previously active cells. And if the cell is not active and there was a prediction, it weakens the dendritic segments. Now, I learned all about the HTM algorithm from watching the HTM School series of videos from Matthew Taylor, who worked at Numenta. Matt tragically passed away last year, and I wanted to personally pay tribute to him here. His passion and enthusiasm was infectious, and he'll be greatly missed by the entire machine learning community.
Well, sparsity is something that doesn't run really well on existing hardware. It doesn't really run really well on GPUs and on CPUs. And so that would be a way of sort of bringing more brain principles into the existing system on a commercially valuable basis.
There's a large body of work on training dense networks to yield sparse networks for inference, but this limits the size of the largest trainable sparse model to that of the largest trainable dense model. This was the case, actually, until relatively recently. Now, since the 1980s, we've known that it's possible to eliminate a significant number of parameters from a neural network without affecting accuracy at inference time. Pruning can substantially reduce the computational demands of inference when the appropriate hardware is utilized to do so. When the goal is to reduce inference costs, pruning often occurs late in training. Now, in 1995, researchers discovered that retrospectively pruning low-magnitude connections worked impressively well. Later, researchers found that retraining the pruned connections produced even better results, or even better still, rinsing and repeating the process with multiple rounds of pruning and retraining. Other approaches explored adding connections back in at random, or even focusing on non-uniform sparsity, which is to say adding the connections in where they are most needed in the network. Jonathan Frankel, who was on the show last year, by the way, released his lottery ticket hypothesis in 2019, which demonstrated that if we can find a sparse neural network with iterative magnitude pruning, then we can train that sparse network from scratch to the same level of accuracy. However, as the demands of training have exploded, researchers have begun to investigate the possibility that networks can be pruned early in training or even before training. The benefit of doing so could reduce the cost of training existing models and make it possible to continue exploring the phenomena that emerge at larger scales. Recently, several methods have been proposed specifically for pruning at initialization. SNP aims to prune weights that are least salient for the loss. GRASP aims to prune weights that most harm or least benefit gradient flow. And SynFlow, which Yannick made a video about by the way, aims to iteratively prune weights with the lowest synaptic strengths in a data-independent manner, with the goal of avoiding layer collapse, where pruning concentrates on certain layers. Now, Frankel pointed out in his recent summary paper that magnitude pruning after training outperforms all of these pre-initialization methods. Most of these methods effectively prune the layers, not the weights, which is to say you can perform similarly well even if you randomly shuffle the weights that they prune in each layer. Now, interestingly, SynFlow and magnitude pruning work quite well at initialization time without seeing any data. Now, Frankel didn't identify a single cause for why these methods struggle to prune in a specific fashion at initialization time, and thought that this is an important question for future investigation. Perhaps there are properties of optimization that make pruning specific weights difficult or impossible at initialization, perhaps because the training occurs in multiple phases. Now, combining gradient descent training with an optimal sparse topology can lead to state-of-the-art results with smaller networks. In the brain, Numenta argues that sparsity is key for how information is stored and processed. They also believe it to be one of the most important missing ingredients in modern deep learning. We reached out to Numenta after the show, and their VPs of Machine Learning Architecture and Research and Engineering, so Lawrence Bracklin and Subtai Ahmed, told us that at a high level, the biggest difference is that they view sparse networks as a unique standalone class of artificial neural networks that mirror the sparsity exhibited in the brain, versus being a derivative of dense networks created by pruning. So, not really removing redundant connections, but creating networks that are designed to be sparse. In 2019, Numenta released a paper called Sparsity Enables 50 times Performance Acceleration in Deep Learning Networks. In that paper, they pointed to the scaling challenges faced by the current state-of-the-art neural networks. They said that the brain is highly efficient, right? Requiring a mere 20 watts to operate, which is less power than a light bulb. Contrast that to GPT-3, which costs millions of dollars to train. Numenta believe that by studying the brain and understanding what makes it so efficient, they can create new algorithms that approach the efficiency of the brain. They think that the core reason the brain is so efficient is the notion of sparsity. A sparse network is one where all of the neurons are not densely connected to every other in the same cortical area. The brain stores and processes information as sparse representations. At any given time, only a small percentage of the neurons in the brain are active. This sparsity may vary, from less than 1% to a few percent of neurons being active, but it's always sparse. Sparsity will lead to a massively smaller memory footprint because only the non-zero elements are stored, enabling the hardware to run more networks simultaneously. GPUs and tensor processing units, so TPUs, they are dense execution engines. They perform the same computation task on an entire vector or matrix of data. This is a wise approach when the vector or matrix is dense, which is to say it's all non-zero. But in the dense environment, we gain efficiency by executing a single instruction to be applied to all of the data. This is an approach called SIMD. But when the data is predominantly zeros, then a prodigious amount of computation is wasted. So if you're keeping up to date on AI hardware, you might have heard of GraphCore or Cerebrus. Cerebrus in particular, actually, they've developed this epic microprocessor with 850,000 cores and 40 gigabytes of memory on board. It's absolutely insane. Not only that, the chip has been designed to support sparsity from the ground up. These Cerebrus cores never multiply by zero. The scheduling operates at the granularity of a single data value, so all of the zeros are filtered out, and this in turn provides a performance advantage by doing useful work during those cycles, which otherwise would have been wasted, not to mention the power and efficiency savings. Now recently in a presentation they showed this graphic claiming to achieve near linear speed up in respect of sparsity, about 84 speed up for 94% sparsity. Numenta released this paper a couple of years ago before the current sparse hardware was released, and at the time they chose an FPGA, which is a field programmable gate array, as the platform to run their performance tests, because of the flexibility it provided in handling sparse data efficiently. In addition, random access to memory is far more granular and efficient on an FPGA, enabling FPGA implementations to efficiently handle the unstructured access patterns in sparse networks. Now, in their paper, as well as confirming the previous results in the literature about the robustness of sparse networks to noise and variance error, they also realized a significant performance gain from using this specialized FPGA hardware. Now, my intuition is that there's no difference at all between the representational power of a discrete HTM type model, which they used in their previous generation of algorithmic approaches, versus an artificial neural network. The obvious difference is that feed-forward monolithic vector space models are more amenable to training given today's hardware. Pretty much everyone agrees that sparse networks are better, but is there something fundamentally special about sparsity? Numenta certainly seem to think so. They anecdotally point to the brain as being sparse, but the brain is probably sparse for the same reason that I don't decide to get up every morning and travel to every city in the UK. It doesn't seem like a profound insight, to be honest. We can take it as a given that sparse networks suffer less from overfitting because they're not going to be using their precious representational power memorizing individual, challenging or non-representative examples in the training data. It remains unknown if the performance of the best pruning algorithms is an upper bound on the quality of sparse models. There's actually some really interesting papers out there now, like Momentum ResNet, which allow us to train huge neural networks with a small memory footprint. But the key question is, are sparse networks functionally better than huge densely connected neural networks? Researchers from Google released the paper Rigging the Lottery, Making All Tickets Winners back in 2019. The rigging the lottery algorithm starts with a randomly initialized connection topology and then layer by layer adds and removes connections, densifying the layer and then sparsifying again using a traditional weight magnitude heuristic. The algorithm achieves higher accuracy than all previous techniques for a given computational cost at all levels of sparsity, and then scored higher accuracy than the dense to sparse algorithms. Now, Numenta say that they've also produced a similar algorithm, although as far as I know it's not been made public yet, so I assume it's pretty similar to Google's approach as they pointed us in this direction. But unlike traditional dense to sparse iterative magnitude pruning, Google's algorithm allows the topology to grow also during the optimization, which can apparently help overcome some of the local minima. Obviously, the most accurate sparsity algorithms required at a minimum the cost of training a large dense network in terms of memory and computational horsepower, but that approach has serious limitations, right? The size of the sparse model you can learn is strongly bounded on the size of the larger dense model which you're sparsifying from as a starting point. It's simply too inefficient to waste computation on so many parameters, which would end up being zero anyway. Google's algorithm seems unequivocally better than dense iterative magnitude pruning, which is somewhat surprising to be honest, given that it seems to be doing the same thing but only one layer at a time. Now, training MobileNet 1 and 2 on ImageNet with this form of sparse training was instructive. It was possible to train a sparse network with nearly the same accuracy in about 30% of the compute time. It was also possible to train a large sparse network which was 5% better accuracy in roughly double the flops of training the original dense version.
Today's neural networks have this something called a point neuron, which is a very simple model of a neuron. And by adding dendrites to them at just one more level of complexity that's in biological systems, you can solve problems in continuous learning and rapid learning. So we're trying to bring the existing field, and we'll see if we can do it. We're trying to bring the existing field of machine learning commercially along with us. You brought up this idea of paying for it commercially along with us as we move towards the ultimate goal of a true AI system.
Now, Numenta is working on some really cool stuff behind the scenes. Unfortunately, there's very little information about it in the public domain yet. Jeff's main aim is to realize the vision of the 1,000 brains theory in an efficient computational algorithm. Sparse networks are just a tiny part of this vision. The next step is implementing continual learning with active dendrites, and this essentially means that they need to be able to add new synapses and train them independently of the existing ones. This is going to require a sparsified version of backprop, which will also require specialized hardware and algorithms to implement. They also mentioned to us that they want to exploit activation and weight sparsity simultaneously, mirroring the Neocortex. Anyway, next week on Street Talk.
Another book that I read around the same time that had a big impact on me, and there was actually a little bit of overlap with Jean Piaget as well, and I read it around the same time, is Jeff Hawkins' On Intelligence, which is a classic. And he has this vision of the
Let's
mind
kick off with the main show.
as
Hope you enjoy it,
a
folks.
multi-scale hierarchy of temporal prediction modules. And these ideas really resonated with me, like the notion of a modular hierarchy of potentially of compression functions or prediction functions. I thought it was really, really interesting, and it reshaped the way I started thinking about how to build minds.
Let's kick off with the main show. Hope you enjoy it, folks.
Well, I fell in love with brains actually when I read an article by Francis Crick, who was one of the co-discoverers of DNA. And Francis had later in his life turned his interest to neuroscience. And he wrote this essay that appeared in Scientific American, where it was sort of the emperor has no clothes type of essay. He said, you know what, we have all this data about the brain, and it's really wonderful. We collected all this data, and we've got decades and decades, but no one has a clue what the hell's going on. And he says, you know, we need new ways of thinking about the brain. We don't necessarily need more data. And that just struck me. I was 22, and I was like, oh crap, you know, that's just a puzzle. We have these pieces, and someone has to put the pieces together. And that seemed like something I would be good at, or at least I would enjoy. And that's got me going. That was the thing that just, I said, I'm going to make a career out of this. And then very quickly I realized that, well, you know, this is the long thing it's going to take a long time. And, but if we do this, then if we really figure out how the brain works and what it does, then we will have real big insights into how to make intelligent machines. And so I said, oh my God, the implications are huge, not just from a neuroscience, but from an AI point of view. And so that got me going on this journey. And at that point, I decided to change careers from engineering to neuroscience, computer engineering, computer science to neuroscience, and start all over again. I just got my degree from university. So it was like, yep, starting again. Here we are 40 years later. It's been a long journey, though, as you probably know. There's been a lot of twists and turns to it.
Absolutely. Well, we really enjoyed reading your book, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the tribalism in the machine learning community. So I've been doing a bit of research online, and your mission right now is to try and convince other people of your ideas. You've got this incredibly exciting idea of the brain, and as you just said, that in some level of abstraction, the brain is infinitely complicated. But actually, if you think about it in terms of simple rules that can produce a lot of complexity, it's not that complicated. But you know, I've noticed that when you speak to some of the machine learning folks, they are very quick to dismiss your ideas, and they say, well, there's no material difference with monolithic neural networks with point neurons and backprop, and you know, it's good that people are so passionate about what they believe in, but by the same token, it means that science only advances one funeral at a time.
Yeah, it's a very complex issue you bring up here, and I think our mission isn't to convince people. Our mission was to figure out what the hell's going on in our heads. That was the first thing we had to do. And we've made a lot of progress on that. Now, we have to sell those ideas. We have to sell them to neuroscientists. So we publish papers, I speak at conferences, people cite our work, they test it and so on. That has to happen. It takes time. Then we now have a roadmap. We can now, from the position I'm in and some of the people who work with me, we can see where the shortcomings are in current AI techniques. We can see, oh, the brain's doing it differently. It's doing it this way. And we can have two approaches to go forward. We could say, well, we need to convince everybody else, which is not really a fun thing to do. Or we can just put our ideas out there, document them, show people them, and then work at doing this ourselves. Like just demonstrate it, start building things, making things that work, making things that solve problems that other people have been struggling with. So we're doing a bit of all these things. We're promoting the neuroscience theory. We're promoting these ideas in the machine learning community, and we're also implementing this stuff because in the end, you can't implement it unless you understand it. So it's a good test for us too. And you would wish, everyone wish like, oh, I wish everyone just, agreed with us, or everyone, got what we understand. But the reality is, it's a big world. There's lots of people. And there's a lot of people who want to dismiss new ideas, but that's just the nature of the beast, right? We just have to accept that. Science is not just science. You have to promote your ideas as well as discover them, and the same is true in the machine learning world.
Well, one thing that's kind of interesting about that, philosophical aspect that you have of, look, it's a big world, there's lots of people doing a lot of different things, that's kind of the heart of evolution, right? Is that there's variation, people taking different approaches, and natural selection will kind of sort out, which ones work and don't work. And that's one thing I've always thought about. A lot of the folks that don't want to pay attention to what the brain does is they don't have a sufficient appreciation for how much, let's say, work has gone into designing the human brain, right? I mean, 1 billion years of life, however many hundreds of millions of years of intelligent evolution. So certainly we can learn things from the neuroscience, right? I mean, and of course, that was the original inspiration for the artificial neuron, but that was just one tiny, simplest possible abstraction of a neuron.
And that happened, what, 50 years ago or
right.
60 years
There's got to be more we can learn, right?
But the way I look at it is we're all trying to reach the same end goal. We're all trying to figure out how to build intelligent machines that are truly intelligent. We all agree they're intelligent. We can talk about the implications of that. And I don't think there will be multiple ways of doing this. It's like in the end, there aren't multiple ways of building computers. They're all some sense universal Turing machines, and then we have variations on that. And so I think that's what's going to happen here too. Now, a priori, how would I know that engineers couldn't figure this all out just by thinking about and doing engineering stuff? My guess was that we'd have to figure out how the brain works first. And who knows? I could have been wrong. That was a bet. Maybe people would figure it out. But here we are 67 years later in the field of AI. And I think today's AI systems are still incredibly limited. They don't really do much at all with it, like, it's intelligent. That's my opinion. They're very, very restricted. They don't generalize. They don't create behaviors. It's just so many things that we're so far away. And now we took a long time, and now we figured out a lot about how the brain works. So now we have a roadmap. So I think it's going to be a lot easier. It's not just like, I think it's going to be quicker to study the brain. And other people say, no, I don't think it will be. I said, well, we now have some things we really understand about the brain. We don't have to worry about that anymore. So the approach we took has been fruitful. And I should also say, just be clear, today's AI is really useful. So I have nothing against it. It's great. It's just not intelligent, and I want to build intelligent machines.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to get to talk to you. Your book on intelligence is actually one of the very first books about AI I ever read. So it's your fault that I'm part of this field now.
I always feel bad when people tell me, I hope it worked out okay for you.
No, it's been a wonderful journey, and I'm really glad that it was one of my first exposures to the field in a way. It was so full of like really interesting ideas, especially at the time, seemed very revolutionary. And it very much shaped my thinking. So I want to ask you a little bit. It feels to me as, someone who I work with deep learning, a lot, of course, nowadays. It feels to me that a lot of your ideas seem validated in a lot of deep learning practices. A currently kind of like emerging trend is how, with like these, maybe you've heard of stuff like these transformer models that are becoming very popular recently, that scaling these larger, it's just stacking these transformer layers seems to currently at least increase performance in in a pretty consistent manner. And I wonder, well, it feels like that it kind of validates in a way, it's like a different proposal to what you say about like a cortical uniformity. Do you think there's any kind of connection?
I don't think about, I'll answer your question, but let's just say I'm always forward thinking. I never look back. And so I don't worry about, hey, was I right about this or not? Or this, does somebody get credit for this or that? I don't really care. So it's like, let's go forward. What's the best thing we can do right now? And so, I think you can obviously, as I said earlier, we're all going to converge on the same thing, right? Eventually, I think. So ideas become, I got ideas from other people people get ideas from me. The history of how that milieu of ideas travels is very difficult to point to. So I'm very reluctant to claim precedent in anything. I just feel like, hey, if we're all moving towards the same idea, it's great. I don't think transformers are an implementation of the cortical column or the cortical algorithm idea. We're not there yet because we now know what the core of that algorithm is. It has to do with movement and reference frames. And transformers don't have that in some sense. They have a very primitive sort of attentional movement, if you want to think of it that way. But nothing like the kind of movement and reference frame we talk about. So it's a little bit in the right direction. And of course they're really impressive. But it's not close to what I think we need to get to.
Yeah, it's really fascinating though, because transformers are strange beasts. They perform a kind of information routing, and it's quite esoteric exactly how they work. And I think in some sense they're similar to capsules. I know capsules have been equated to some of your work, but I wanted to talk a little bit more deeper than that though. So a lot of your ideas from a machine learning point of view come down to the fundamental dichotomy of discrete representations versus continuous representations, which is what we use in deep learning. We use vectors. And there are some advantages to using these continuous vector spaces, namely that you get for free some spatial priors, so you can encode semantic similarity as a function of how close they are, and also you have gradients which are useful for stochastic gradient descent. And interestingly, the manifold hypothesis states that most natural data falls on very smooth and low dimensional manifolds. So all of the human faces could be projected onto a low dimensional manifold. But I know that a lot of your work has been really solely focused on these sparse distributed representations, and then building on top in the encoding, for example. So if I'm encoding a date representation, I would do it such that the sparse distributed representation would have a significant overlap for date times that are in the vicinity. And so semantically similar things should intersect each other, and spatial relations between bits can be encoded using a receptive field, similar to how it works in CNN. So but Numenta has asserted that intelligence wouldn't be possible without these SDRs, and they're the primitive of intelligence. So what do you think about the kind of comparison between vectors and these discrete representations that you're an advocate?
Well, let's just start, the whole idea of these sparse representations comes because that's how brains work. I mean, there's no question about it. If you look in a brain, you look at any population of cells that are representing something, at any point in time, most of the cells are inactive. It can be anywhere from, 90% to 99% of the cells are inactive. You just don't see, of the information carrying neurons, there's some neurons that fire all the time. We're not talking about those. But the ones that carry information, you just do not see any kind of dense representations. That is when that happens, you're having a seizure. And we also see that in real neurons that they're not very high fidelity. They don't carry individual spiking rates, are very crude. There's many instances where even the first spike is actually the most important thing for carrying information. So we're not there's no sort of high resolution, 4 bits or 3 bits, or even often 1 bit of precision in the firing of a neuron, right? So this doesn't exist in the brain. So we just take that, okay, well, we need to understand why that is. And it's not just, it's more efficient from an energy point of view. That's not what it is. It turns out that sparse representations have a lot of really desirable and interesting properties that you don't get with dense representations. We can talk about those. It's not like everything is, there's a spectrum here, right? There are some parts of the brain where you have representations which are a little bit less dense, maybe 10% of the neurons are firing, and there the activity rates really do matter. They're still not high precision, but they really do matter. And then we believe there's other parts where they're very, very sparse. I might have 5,000 neurons and let's say 2% are active, so I have 100 active neurons. And all the information is encoded, almost all the information is coding in the population code, not in the firing rates. And we can talk about that if you want to dive into the details, what the advantage of sparse distributed representations. But it is an empirical observation of the brain. So, we're going to start with that is, okay, well, why is it that way?
Well, one thing I wanted to understand is because you made the comment before that they could improve generalization, but intuitively they're the opposite of improving generalization because they have such an incredible specificity. So, for example, when I was reading through some of your literature, when you use boosting, for example, in your algorithm, it increases the specificity to such an extent. But then the way we generalize in our cognition isn't necessarily through the representation; it's through the abstractness of the concept we're learning. Would you argue?
Yeah, so I'll be honest with you. I've changed my opinion about this. I used to believe exactly what you're saying, which is these overlaps between these SDRs are really how you're going to get generalization. We now realize it is a much more powerful form of generalization. I talked about it briefly in my new book, 1,000 Brains. I don't know if we really discussed it in any of our papers yet. And this is the idea that so I can switch into that. So I'm admitting, right? Yeah, I don't think it's what I said before. Okay. All right. We learn. But there's a much more powerful form of generalization. If you want, I can delve into that right now. It's not, okay. So we have this, what we've learned is that each cortical column, we say the brain in general, is, it's building this sort of, the model of the world. You can think of it as a graph, but you can literally think of it as where are things relative to other things? It's like a computer-aided design model, right? CAD model. It's literally doing that. You have a model of something like a computer or your house or room or bird or ideas. They're structured using reference frames and data populating reference frames, locations in reference frames. And so you can imagine my knowledge of something. Again, as you know, in the book, I use the coffee cup example quite a bit, but you can use anything. A knowledge of, say, a stapler is it has a certain set of parts, which are then arranged in a certain relative position of each other, and they have certain movements related to each other. And that structure is that graph, if you will, is the definition of that object. That's your model of it. That's how you represent it in your brain. Now, when you learn it, the way you do this is you attend to individual components one at a time. So if I were to look at a new object I haven't seen before, like a stapler, I would just attend to one end to look at what's this thing look like, and what's that thing look like. And as you attend to these different parts, you're essentially building this graph. You're essentially building the model. You're saying, okay, this component, I recognize it. That's like a hinge. This component over here looks like maybe a button. This component here looks like a rubber pad. And I just start building this model in my head. But whoops, microphone over there. I start building this model. Okay, so you got this. I'm trying to paint a picture in your head. How you're doing this every moment of your life as you look around. Even like you're looking at the screen right now, you're looking and see different things. You see where they are relative to each other. I think most generalization in the world comes about from the process of, if I see something new that I haven't seen before, or I'm experiencing something new, it doesn't matter, revision, but just imagine you're seeing something new. You don't recognize it. You don't see this arrangement as a familiar arrangement. Then you look at a subset of the components and you say, okay, let's just focus over here. And you say, well, these three components over here look like something I've seen before. These look like it might be a button that I push down. And this thing over here looks like it might be a hinge. And then you say, well, if it's a hinge, then a button, then this thing, even though I've never seen it before, maybe if I push on this button, the hinge will move. And so you basically, your generalization comes about because subsets of these graphs that you build of the structure in the world are similar to subsets in other graphs you've learned. And you can say, well, these subsets are similar, therefore the behaviors associated with those subsets are similar, the performance of those subsets are similar. So I'm now going to ascribe to the stapler some things I've learned about other things. And if I see something really new, we just keep going down into smaller and smaller pieces until we find something I recognize. And I say, okay, well, that part I recognize. And so that, I believe, is actually the primary way we generalize in the world. We can talk about how SDRs do that too, but anyway.
What you're talking about, it sounds a lot like sort of some of the graph isomorphism, work that people talk about, where if you've got this new thing and it has all these parts and they're in a graph, certain subsets of that graph may be isomorphic to previous, graphs that you've seen, and then therefore you can learn about it. And you said something really interesting, which is when you see something new, you attend to kind of different parts of that, and you're doing kind of a remapping there. And there's a lot of research on grid cells, right, that they remap. So when a rodent goes into a new environment, it remaps the grid cells. Can you talk some, is this related to the remapping? And I'm really curious about, how does that remapping happen in the neurons, and how quickly does it take place,
Yeah. Well, so one of the hypotheses we have with the thousand brains theory is that, well, first of all, we deduce the idea that you need that there is in the cortex, there are these reference frames and these structures, these graphs, right? We can deduce that. It's like, okay, well, I know this is happening. I walk through the logic behind that. And then at first to me, it was very odd. Like, how could neurons build these graphs, right? How do they structure them? With the way I used to focus is like, my cortex knows where my finger is relative to the thing it's touching, like relative to the thing it's touching, not relative to my body. And so I use the example of the coffee cup, and the coffee cup moves around, so the reference frame has to move with the coffee cup. I was like, holy crap, how does that happen? It's really hard for neurons to do this. And then, of course, we looked into the literature of the hippocampal complex, which is grid cells in the entorhinal cortex and place cells in the hippocampus. And there's a whole bunch of stuff. And there's a 20-year or 30-year history of research in this field. It's not in the neocortex, but it's something that's very related to the neocortex. And that's what it's clear that grid cells and place cells and these other types, these vector cells that exist there, are building maps just like this. And so we said, okay, well, it's likely then that the same mechanisms that are used by grid cells are probably going to be used in the cortex. And at the time we made that was a purely evolutionary argument. It was like saying, it seems unlikely evolution is going to discover something like this twice. It's really hard to do, right? It's really, really hard to do this. So, and animals had to know where they were in the world a long time ago. So they probably evolved this complex mechanism from knowing where they are. And now the brain's going to use that same mechanism for knowing where like your eyes are or your fingers are, or it's going to use the same mechanism for everything else. And so we just said, hey, it's probably likely that the same basic mechanism that uses grid cells and place cells and vector cells is going on in the cortex. At the time we made that prediction, we were not aware of any evidence that that was the case. And now there's a lot of evidence for it. Now people are finding grid cells throughout the cortex. So the general idea, I'll get into your details in a moment, but the general idea that, hey, the same mechanisms are work in both places seems to be right. And now we don't understand those mechanisms completely. Even though there are 30 years of research on grid cells and place cells, there's still some mysteries about them. But there's still a lot that's known. And so we can map on the concepts I was talking about, like, okay, where am I? Where am I in this graph? What do I place in that graph? You can think of that a little bit like place cells and grid cells. You can think of remapping is, there's two types of remapping. Like, this is a whole new thing, so let's just start with a new graph, or versus let's fix the graph I already got, and that's very much related, as you said, Keith, to remapping of grid cells. Not that we understand that completely. We don't. No one does. But we know a lot about it. It's a very technical field in the neuroscience literature.
Right. I've been fascinated by Douglas Hofstadter. He has a really interesting idea on cognition, and he says that cognition is a little bit like the interstate freeway, in the sense that we have this ability to make analogies, and this is something that current AI systems cannot do. And a lot of the symbolic folks are saying, well, of course deep learning models can't do it. You're just interpolating on a manifold, for goodness sake. But your conception of reference frames I found fascinating, because they're not just on your sensory inputs. You actually said that thinking is a little bit like traversing through concept space through these reference frames. And that's absolutely fascinating. So, but the thing is, when we learn information, many of us learn information differently, but we learn the same knowledge and the same facts. We all know how to speak the same language. And you did allude to this in your book, that there are some interesting differences in the topology of how you learn information, but we still seem to be able to reconcile it in the same way.
Yeah, well, sometimes, it's like the way I view it. Again, we're telling stuff that some of this hasn't been published anywhere yet. But the way I view it is, if I think of myself as part of the cortex, as a cortical column, I don't know what my input represents, and I don't know where I am in the world. I just don't know anything. I'm just a bunch of neurons, right? And so I have to discover. I get two pieces of information. I get some sensory data, and I also get information about how my sensor is moving in the world. We could talk about how that happens, but I get some knowledge, and so I have to figure out on my own, what is the dimensionality of the space? What kind of space is it? I don't have a preconceived. It's not like, oh, the world is three-dimensional. I don't know that. I don't know if it's two-dimensional, three-dimensional, or n-dimensional. I've just kind of figure out, and I have to figure out what is the structure of which I'm going to place this information. And when you and I look at a chair, we both see it as three-dimensional. It is a three-dimensional object. We're going to build three-dimensional reference frames for that chair. They're going to be pretty similar. It's going to be hard for you to have a representation of the chairs that's significantly different than mine. But when we look at things that we might not sense directly, something that someone tells me about or I'm reading about in a book, the kind of reference frames you and I might create for the same facts could be very different. And so we can arrange the same data in different reference frames because we can't directly sense it. We're basically relying on information coming from other people. And so we can end up with like the same facts represented differently and reach to different conclusions. And this is why we have different beliefs about the world. It's always about things we can't sense directly. If we can sense them directly, then we generally have the same belief about it, but the same kind of structure. So I think this is a fascinating idea, but it's really fascinating to me is that there is no notion about the dimensionality of the world that a column is looking at and the data. So it can represent almost any kind of data as long as you can figure out from a movement vector and a sense movement data and sense data. It can say, can I build a map of this thing that makes sense, a predictive map? And if it can, that's my understanding of it.
Another beautiful thing about it is the fact that your brain is creating these binary encodings at all. Like when I was researching this, I found it very interesting that for grid cells, there is some topography, at least in the visual cortex, or in the visual layer, I'm sorry. So, grid cells that are nearby each other will have like a similar orientation, but maybe a different scale. But once you go up a level higher, so those things create the SDR, they create these bits that are very sparsely populated. And then the place cells correspond to combinations of those bits to indicate a certain location. And once you're at that layer, there is no more topography. It's like now they've become truly digital encodings of information, right?
Well, I'm not sure I understand that, because from my understanding, there's always going to be a topology. You're never going to lose it. You may not see that topology in the place cells.
Right.
All right. That's the. I mean, this the neuroscientists who listen to this. I don't want to insult them, because I'm going to make this very simple. I say you can think of like place cells are like what, and the grid cells are like where. Right. Okay. So, and you can say, well, this thing, the what thing, is at this location, type of stuff. And so if you just look at the place cells, this isn't, because they actually do uniquely encode places. So it gets a little confusing here, but you can think of it just generally like that.
Right.
If we're going to go deeper about this, we're going to start getting into all the unknowns about grid cells and place cells, and they're very interesting, the unknown and weird properties. We actually think now that this is work that one of our employees, Marcus, is doing, is we think actually the better way to think about encoding is not, location is not actually through the grid cells, but through these vector cells, things like object vector cells and so on. And the grid cells actually might just play a very interesting singular role. They might play the role of what we call path integration, which is like, if I'm moving in a certain direction, I have to be able to predict where I'll be as I move. That's called path integration. I'm going to predict something. I have to know where I'm going to be when I get there. And that most of the maps, the graph itself, is not built up of grid cells. It's built up these objects, these more like these polar coordinate cells called vector cells. So again, this is an evolving field, and and even stuff we wrote a couple of years ago, we're like, oh, maybe that's not right. It's not like this, but the overall principles are the same. It's still a graph. It's still data at locations in this graph. That hasn't changed. It's just like, how's the graph actually constructed? That's a little tricky.
Right. I mean, it's fascinatingly deep. It's just a fascinatingly deep field. But if I can just tie this back to SDRs, because I know there's always a lot of really confusion or uncertainty about the value of SDRs. And just for our listeners' sake, I wanted to share one intuition and get your take on it, which is, if we are representing, let's say, location in some space, if all we need is 20 bits to do that, so we really only need 20 bits of information to represent a space location to the resolution that we need, then if you go further than that, if you have 10,000 bits and you decide, I'm not going to use 20, I'm going to use all 10,000, put like, little 0.01 values kind of all throughout there, really you're just creating noise in that other space that you could have been using for other purposes, right? And so I think that's one advantage of the SDRs. Like, what do you think about that intuition?
That's a little bit correct. I haven't thought of it that way. Let me just give you my take on some of the advantages of SDRs. So let's say I'm going to represent something. I have 5,000 neurons. I'm going to represent stuff. All right. So let's talk about the capacity. And let's say I'm going to use a 2% sparsity. So I have 100 active neurons and 4,900 active neurons. And first you can say, what is the capacity of the system? How many different representations you can represent? So that's just 5,000 choose 100, and it's gazillion. So then you can say, okay, so there's no representational capacity. Then you say, if I randomly chose these SDRs, what is their overlap? Well, they'll overlap by about 2 neurons each, because each neuron is going to participate in every 50 patterns, but not by a lot more. You won't find 2 patterns randomly overlapping by 50 bits or 30 bits. It's almost statistically impossible almost. So now you have all these patterns you can pick randomly all day long, and they're not going to overlap, so they're very unique. Each one's going to be extremely robust to noise. So you can add 50% noise to any of these patterns, and they're still going to be recognized correctly. Okay, so very noise robust is another thing. So high capacity representation is very noise robust. There's another property that we think is being used everywhere, which is really interesting, and I don't know if there's any equivalent to it in other types of networks, is what we call the union property, where I could invoke not one pattern, but 2, 3, 5, 10 patterns at once. And so now instead of having 100 neurons active, I say I evoke 10 patterns, I'm going to have 1,000 neurons active, 1,000 out of 5,000. Well, it turns out that all the processing that you do still works on all those. You can process them in parallel. That even though you're mixing these things together, the other ends, the neurons that are detecting these patterns don't get confused, and you can show this mathematically. So instead of representing probabilities, like a probability distribution you might think about, the brain often relies on this union property, which is, there are multiple possibilities right now. It's not really a probability distribution. It's just like, these are all possible things that could be happening right now. Let's process them all in parallel and see which one works out.
A superposition.
That's the kind of property that, I guess you could call that, yeah. And you only get, the sparser you are, the more of those you can do, and the whole thing's become, so you got this huge capacity, super noise robustness. It only takes, if I want to recognize one of these patterns of 100 neurons, I only have to connect to 20 of them. So neurons typically don't really detect they look for maybe up to about 20 or 30 synapses at maximum, at a time. So all these are other properties, all these properties come about, yeah.
Since you did mention capacity, though, I would like to, because I did see, some variable statements. Sometimes I've seen no problem whatsoever with capacity. Mathematically, we've got tons of it, but I was listening to one of your research calls, I guess, and you started to question, capacity, I think at least in the grid cell, the entorhinal cortex or some such. So I guess I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is capacity a concern or not a concern? And also, in order to make best use of the capacity, I'm sure the brain must have some type of entanglement. So, machine learned artificial networks, we know that they entangle representations. So there's like weight sharing between different representations. Do you think something similar is happening in biological networks?
Well, I don't know the machine learning field that you're talking about, and so I can't really comment on this idea of entanglement of weights in machine learning. I'm not familiar with it there. I do. I want to maybe correct something about SDRs, which relates to the question you're asking. We think in some parts of the brain, some parts of the neocortex, these very sparse representations work as I just said. There are other places where they're less sparse, maybe 10% sparsity. Grid cells is a great example. If I actually look at a population of grid cells, it's not like 1% sparsity. It's more like 10% sparsity. And there, the activation levels actually do matter. It's not like they matter like 3 digits of precision, but maybe 1 digit of precision. And so that doesn't have all the properties I was just talking about. When you get to like 10%, you can't really do a lot of superposition patterns. So it looks like in some parts of these algorithms, there are sparse patterns that work on some principles, and in other parts they're very, very sparse that work on other principles. It's not everything is super SDRs. I used to think that, but I don't think that anymore. I just became enamored with SDRs. I said, oh my God, this is really cool. How these things work. But we now know that there are, in some parts of these algorithms, you need to have, it's still sparse, but more dense, and activation level matter. And then some of the capacity issues, you don't have those capacity advantages. And so, and that's clearly true with grid cell representations. But I imagine it's true in other things too. I know it's true in other areas too. So it isn't one size fits all here. I do say, we could say for certainty that you don't find anywhere in the brain where anything's represented by full active, fully dense networks where all the neurons are firing at different levels. That just does not exist. It doesn't mean this couldn't be useful, and it doesn't mean that we couldn't in the future do something like that. It just seems very unlikely to me. I know that's how most convolutional neural networks or deep learning networks work today. But you probably know there's a lot of effort going on in sparsity right now in the classic machine learning community. People try to do it, and we're working on that too.
So I think there's something fundamental about the representations we use when we build AI algorithms. There's a dichotomy between, the good old-fashioned AI people. They work at a level of abstraction higher. They try to implement the mind, and us connectionists, we're trying to implement the brain. I think there's something fundamental about that level of abstraction that we work at. So there's a discussion between people like Scott Aronson, who think that computation is raw and should happen at the lowest possible level. So just think of how neural networks work. They distribute knowledge, don't they, across lots and lots of different neurons. And then there's people like Krishnaswamy, and he's a computer scientist, and he thinks that we should be dealing with much higher level computational primitives like functions and types. So I guess from your perspective, because I feel that all of this is strongly emergent. I feel that we could work at the very lowest primitive level of computation and all of the magic emerges. Do you think we should be doing that, or do you think we should be working higher up the stack?
No, I think we have to be working higher up the stack. I mean, of course, you can break any system down and say it's just a bunch of atoms. It's just a bunch of molecules, right? It's just a bunch of cells. And that's true. And you can, in theory, should be able to understand that. But just like thermodynamics says, it's not very useful to think about liquids as a bunch of atoms, right? You need to have something at a higher level than that. And so, what I guess the principle we assume that we have now in some sense discovered that the brain uses this representation scheme using reference frames and movement. Now, I think that's the right level to think about it. You could try to abstract it less than that, but why bother? That is the unit that we're talking about here. These models that are. Well, but okay, go ahead.
That's the thing, though. But the brain was evolvable. It evolved within biological and environmental limitations. And GOFAI people say, well, you know what? Scrap that. Let's just implement the mind directly. They think that functions and types. They're not an imaginary concept that have been invented by humans. They think that mathematical knowledge it's universal and it's been discovered by us, and we would be silly not to implement it directly in this high level language. Because if you think about it, even the knowledge that we have, you wrote about this in your book, it's fascinating that now there's a separation between our genes and the knowledge we've created as the human race. And all of this stuff now is emergent. Our society is emergent. So why not implement it directly? But why trust? Because
you're gonna guess wrong, right? You're gonna say, okay, well, I will figure out what that structure is. What is that mind structure that we're gonna, and so, for example, most of the the good old fashioned AI never considered movement in their fundamental aspects of representation space, right? And, or even do you look for what Dr. Lennart did with psych, same idea, right? But now I know, okay, the brain builds these structures using movement. So it's not like it was a wrong idea of the old AI people. They just didn't pick the right schema. It was the wrong schema.
Well, could you expand on that? Because the thing is, because we've got a GOFAI person we're very good friends with, and he is convinced that there is, like the knowledge engineering bottleneck, and it's very, very brittle and it didn't work very well. But you're reading your chapter on knowledge representation. I think you were saying our brain, it's like lots of models. When we model a stapler, it's actually lots of little models in our brain, and it learns a kind of it analogizes the knowledge in a really sophisticated and distributed way. So when we want to know what happens when we press down on the stapler, we run a simulation in our mind. What happens if I press down on it? What happens if I stretch it? And our models seem to generalize to any version of a stapler we might ever find. So that almost convinced me that we do need to have a lower level representation of knowledge.
Lower than what? Lower than the reference frames I was talking about?
Well, low. So the GOFAI people say that we should use functions and types and relations to describe knowledge. But do you think that's possible?
I don't want to misrepresent GOFAI because they haven't looked at that stuff in a long time. I think you can't do this at the level of the neuron. I mean, obviously brains are made of neurons, but they're not uniform neurons. We have dozens of different types of neurons are hooked up in very complex ways. They do different functions. It's not just one big neural network. That structure is important. And so I think it's now become evident to me, and it wasn't this way 5 years ago. It's really evident to me now that at least in the brain, knowledge is represented in this structured form with reference aims and movement. It's the same inspiration that Newton has with capsules, but he didn't incorporate movement as part of that structure. But now I understand. Okay, well, at least from a brain's point of view, these reference frames are constructed, as I mentioned earlier. They're discovered through movement, observing movement of the sense within the world, and so now we have the basic structure of, if you want to call it GOFAI, is these movement related reference frames and placing and stuff like that. I don't know how I would do it less than that. I don't know how would I get rid of that now? What do I do? Just ignore that and go back and just putting a bunch of neurons together? I don't know. You mean, could you come up with a genetic algorithm that could have discovered this using just traditional neural networks? Sure, maybe you could have. I don't know which is the fastest way of getting there. But now that I know it, why would I want to do something different? I mean, I maybe I'm misunderstanding your question. Try.
Well, I think the main issue is that we don't understand the representation. If you look at the OpenAI microscope and you can visualize all the different neurons and so on, these objects have been distributed in a way which is completely ineffable across all of these different neurons. Yeah. And is that the most high fidelity possible representation of knowledge? I
don't know. But I will say now is I currently believe very strongly that in the future, when we build AI systems, they're going to work more like on these brain structures, and they won't be just highly distributed, mysterious blobs of neurons, right? That's great, by the way. It's great not only because of how they perform, but it's great because we'll understand them a whole lot better. This touches on the issue of the threats of AI, right? So many of the threats of AI are based on the idea that, we don't know what's going to happen. Well, now you actually will know what's going to happen. It's, I designed the thing. It works like this. I can't predict everything, but I don't know what it's going to learn, but I know how it's going to learn and what it's capable of. So I just, I don't want to debate people about this because there are a lot of smart people out there and they may have things that I don't know and they can pursue things. But from where I sit right now, it's very clear to me that, okay, this is how the brains do this. This explains everything. It explains, how we structure all knowledge. And how it evolved, that's a big part of this, and how we have this common algorithm. And it's going to be based on these reference frames and movement and so on. And so, okay, well, why wouldn't I just build that? Let's go for that. Why build something else? If I understand that, why build something else? I don't understand the point of it. Is it going to be better? In the future, we will certainly take, let's say I'm right. And we build machines that work on these principles that I outlined in the book. Well, of course, we can go for that. We don't have to stick to the way biology is. Maybe we'll come up with a better way of representing things in structures and reference frames. Maybe it won't be movement-based. Maybe it'll be something else. I don't know. But could I try and until we build something and get it working, why would I go away from it, Yeah, go ahead.
Try and steel man the GOFAI people, it's because they think that knowledge is universal. We discover it. There is only one representation of knowledge. And clearly in the brain, you can learn things in different ways. I can teach you a curriculum and I can teach you it in a different way. And maybe in some weird way, our brain does learn some latent representation of the knowledge, which is the universal knowledge. But they're making the argument that why don't we just represent it the only way it can possibly exist to start with?
First of all, that's not, it clearly isn't true. Just like you just said, I gave the example in my book about taking a bunch of historical facts and arranging them along a timeline and arranging them on a map. And you end up with different inferences and different beliefs about the same set of facts. So whether there is a universal truth, I don't know. But clearly humans don't know that universal truth. We can't know everything. We can only sense a small part of the world. And the vast majority is invisible to us. So who the hell knows what that universal truth is? What we can do is build good models. And the models, there isn't a universal model. There isn't one correct model for history, right? We might like to believe there is. My model is right and yours was wrong, that kind of thing. But, it's real easy to point out even non-controversial things like the timeline versus the map will lead to different models. And the order in which you train someone will matter, So I think we just have to live with this. And I don't think, maybe there's some platonic GOFAI people thinking there's some Platonic universal knowledge that's correct all the time. I don't know, but I don't think that's accessible to us. If there was, we can't sense the world both physically and time wise. Our senses only deal with a teeny part of the world. It's a good part, but only a little teeny part. We don't even know what the universal truth about space and time is. I mean,
definitely true. If I could move on to some other questions about the
Sure.
brain. So you, of course, focus very much on neocortex as the, seat of human intelligence. And I think you're definitely on the right path with that. I think most people agree something similar to that. But there's also lots of other parts in the brain that seem pretty important. And I'm specifically interested in, so like one thing that machine learning people are often interested in is the dopamine circuit. So like the
Yeah.
cortical, basal ganglia,
Yeah.
thalamico, cortical loop. And which seems really, it seems like a learning signal. It seems like some kind of learning is going on there. Could you maybe say some words about that?
Yeah. So obviously the neocortex is connected to the rest of the brain in myriad ways. Um, it's not in isolation. It's a very complex relationship to lots of other things. That doesn't mean you can't understand what its circuits are doing. But in a human, the neocortex is complexly tied to things. And one of those things is that if you think of the neocortex as this sort of map of the world or model of the world, well, what should it learn? And what goals should it have? The dopamine circuitry is clearly associated with what should we learn? When should we take the effort to learn something which is metabolically expensive? And so somebody has to decide that. My basic contention is the decision is not the neocortex's decision, right? Mostly it's somebody else's decision. And when we build intelligent machines, we'll have to figure out who's making that decision. And it won't be in the neocortical equivalent. It'll be in another part of the intelligent machine's equivalent. But there's absolutely no reason we would have to model the goals and emotions and other things that other parts of the brain do, unless you wanted to create something that was human-like, right? So, I used to joke that our dopamine signal in our models is a switch. I turn it on, I turn it off. I can learn now, stop learning now, right? Just manually turn it on, manually turn it off when we run experiments. There doesn't have to be anything, more complicated than that. But there's, the only thing I'm claiming here is when we build intelligent machines, if we build them on the principles in the neocortex, they have to be embodied. I mentioned this, the whole chapter in the book about they have to be embodied in some sort, physical or non-physical embodiment, but some embodiment. They have to have, various sort of safeguards built in. They have to have various mechanisms for what to learn and what not to learn. Someone has to provide goals. What should the goals of the system be? What are we trying to achieve right now? And, but so those things have to exist, but they don't have to be modeled on, I don't see any reason at all to model those on the neural circuits, the way the neurons do that. Now we're getting pure biology. We're now getting into what does a biological organism need, including like keeping your heart going and breathing and, making sure you have sex and all these things. Ignore that. Just, if we're going to build intelligent machines, just make them a little bit to our purpose, I guess I would say.
Another neuroscience question is that I know, a lot of people are skeptical that the brain can do anything remotely like backpropagation, right? I mean, there's sort of good arguments for why that's just not possible. But on the other hand, I don't know if you've seen kind of a lot of the recent work by Blake Richards at McGill University, where he talks about you can do something that performs in a very similar way to backpropagation because, and especially in the neocortex, the neurons there had these very long apical dendrites, and they had these sections with these calcium channels that can do these very long-lasting activations that trigger like spike trains. And he's saying that there is evidence that if you have feedback from a higher or downstream layer back into the apical dendrite connections, that can have an effect of creating something like backpropagation. It's like stochastic backpropagation. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm a little bit familiar with that work and Blake Richards' work a little bit. I view it a little bit of a distraction because backpropagation is a cool idea. It works on classic neural networks pretty well. I don't think the end result is like the kind of networks you see in the brain at all. I don't think the kind of learning that backpropagation does is the kind of learning we see in the brain. And so there's lots of other theories of what those apical dendrites are doing and why you have that stuff. So I'm not going to say that backpropagation isn't occurring anywhere in the brain. I don't know. Maybe it is. But it hasn't played a role in our theories about the brain. And I think a lot of people spend time trying to shoehorn in there. Like, I'm going to prove it to you. See, the brain really is doing this. It's like, well, but the brain doesn't look like anything else. None of this stuff. The brain doesn't look like anything like you're talking about here. You're just trying to put this, one little piece backprop into this thing. I mean, for example, just take away learning. We know that learning in a neurons have these dendritic branches, and the synapses are distributed on these branches. This is key. This is critical. You can't get around this. There's important information, theoretic reason for this. It's not just some other reason. It's doing something important from an information point of view. And so the whole idea of backprop, working with learning on individual dendritic segments, I don't even know what that means, right? It's hard to fit in. So to my mind, it's like noise. I kind of like tune it out, saying, well, if they figure out something really important, they'll let me know.
Well, I mean,
I'll pay attention to it.
Yeah, I think more his motivation, and I quite agree with this. It's about taking inspiration from the brain. So this algorithm that they discovered by kind of looking for things that could, at least enable, feedback mechanisms for the training. Is it?
But are they taking inspiration from the brain, or are they taking inspiration from neural networks and trying to figure out the brain could do?
What they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out how can the brain do deep training, how can the brain do deep learning,
but assuming assuming backprop is what they want.
No, they just want to know, how can it do deep learning? And so then they look very carefully at the biology, and they find this alternative mechanism which can produce results that are very similar to backpropagation, but actually it's slightly better in some ways. And so it's leading to inspiration for how to improve ML. And I guess that's the question I really wanted to ask you, which is, I always ask this what's missing question. Okay, so we have artificial neural networks. Clearly, they're a very stripped down, micro abstraction of what happens in the brain. If you could add in a few things, like just 1, 2, 3 kind of abstract properties to neural networks today, what would you suggest should be added to get the biggest bang for the buck? Like, how can we incrementally improve them?
Okay, well, so that's what we're doing at Numenta right now. So my colleague Subutai Ahmad, who's really the machine learning expert, I'm more of the neuroscience guy, he put together a roadmap. Well, we did it together, but he's implementing it. A roadmap. The idea is like, hey, we have these grand theories about the neocortex and so on. Maybe they're right, maybe they're not, but we think they're right. Well, what do we do next? Like, what do we do? Right. So the answer to the question was, well, how do we incrementally get from where we are today, machine learning, to where we think we need to be some number of years from now? And so we literally have a roadmap. And we started off by saying, okay, first I'm going to focus on sparsity. And so we've been doing that, and we've been making really interesting progress. Some of it which we published, and some of it we haven't yet. About introducing sparsity to first we did it for convolutional neural networks, and we did it for other types of networks. Now we're doing it for transformers, and showing that we can speed these things up and make them more robust. And I'm talking speed things up by a lot, not a little bit, by a lot. Depends on the network, depends on all these different things, but how do you implement that on hardware? So we start with sparsity. The next thing we're working on is the dendritic computation, because what the dendrites get you, and we haven't really talked about this much at all so far, but with the dendrites, each individual section of a dendrite is like its own little computational pattern recognizer. They allow you to represent information in different contexts. And so this is, we think, is going to make it far less training data to train existing networks. And allow us to do continuous learning. Because when you train a neuron, you don't train all the synapses. You only modify a few on one of these dendritic branches, and so you can learn without forgetting things. So we're working on that. So I can take existing networks, make them so that there can be continually learning, or they don't forget things, and make them so you can train them with far fewer data points. And then so we're well into that now. And then the third thing, which the next big one, which is sort of biting off the whole concept of reference frames. And we're just starting that. And it probably will take several years. And then finally we do the whole 1,000 brains theory. We have lots of these columns and so on. So at least we put together, we have a roadmap, we're working to it. I think, I'll be honest with you, I think the progress we've made is actually far better than I thought it would be. I thought it would take us longer to achieve the things we're achieving. The performance gains we're getting are really something dramatic, and without losing accuracy. So that's what Numenta is working on. And I don't think we've talked about this roadmap, but we haven't given all the details of it yet.
So it's not public yet, the roadmap.
Well, the roadmap, I've talked about it in talks. I just spoke about it here, right? So I have pictures of represent that stuff. But the details, how we're doing it, like we've discovered, like you talk about sparsity. The problem is you want to run sparse networks. You want to run them on some hardware, right? What kind of hardware are you going to run them on? Is it GPUs, CPUs, FPGAs? Well, we're doing all of those. But they all have their problems and issues. And because GPUs don't like sparse networks, at least you don't get any benefit from them. And FPGAs are hard to use, but they're good, but they're really hard to use. Where we discovered, and including very recently, we've discovered tricks, engineering tricks that allow you to map sparse networks onto some of these existing architectures better than we think anyone else has been able to do by a pretty large margin. These are very engineering problems. They're not pure theoretical problems. They're very big engineering problems, and we have to solve those, because it's no good to say, hey, sparsity is great if you can't run it faster on something. It's got to really work in the real world. So it's exciting. We'll see how far we go, but right at the moment it's going great. I'm really thrilled by it. We've actually decided to invest more in it because we're hiring more people, because it seems to be working so well.
So we've been talking a lot about intelligence, however that might exactly be defined. I think we're all on kind of the same page what we mean when we talk about intelligence. The neocortex, this map, this ability, however you might exactly want to define it. But we've also talked, we've a little bit moved, talked about motivations, about, which may, relate more to dopamine or whatever, in the brain there. You just raw neocortical intelligence. So in your book, you and of course, dedicate a good chunk of it to these questions of motivations, of risks, of benefits. And you describe yourself as someone who's pretty skeptical about severe risks. So one of the things which I fully agree with, by the way, is you very elegantly describe how intelligence is kind of like having a map. The map itself has no motivations. It's not good or evil. It's just a tool. It could be used to do something nice or something good, or it could be used to do something bad. The map itself is orthogonal to these kind of questions of motivations and, to good or bad. It's kind of the human idea of, we can't get it ought from it is. But at some point, of course, when we actually build these systems, we don't want an ought to be in there, right? We do want our systems to actually do things. At some point, we don't want robots sitting there and know everything, but never take any actions. In the book, you, for example, give the example of, we want them, to go to Mars and then, build a colony and not just sit around the sun all day, thinking about the universe or whatever. So at some point, we have to introduce some kind of motivational system. The brain seems to solve this according to this, what you call the old brain. And I'm not sure exactly which parts you count as the old brain versus the new brain, but some are quite obvious. We have circuits that give us hunger or, other motivations or whatever. But it seems like these parts will be very important. That, okay, let's assume your project goes fantastically. 20 years from now, Numenta is the biggest AI company in the world. You've developed
not our goal, by the way, but
I do. But you figured out the neocortex. You've created a wonderful algorithm. At some point, we have to inject motivation. I'm sure you agree with. And we have to assure that those motivations align to human, what we would want. And that seems like a hard problem. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know if it's a hard problem. I think the concern that people have about this is that these machines will evolve their own motivations, or somehow they are some sort of, epiphenomena that disappears. I don't think that's right. I think we will have to work hard to put them in there, like I mentioned earlier. It will not be easy. We'll have to design how these systems work. Unless we put this machine in some sort of evolutionary structure, whether it's a self-replicating machine or it just uses evolutionary algorithms, genetic algorithms to decide what its motivations are, they won't modify themselves. They won't change on their own. I gave the very simplistic example of a self-driving car, but I think it's a correct example. I tell the car where I want it to go, it's not going to decide to go someplace else because today it feels different. I could make a car that does that, but why would I do that? It's not going to design a car to do that. So if we send robots to Mars to build machines, they'll have to be motivated to solve the tasks they've been given. But we will also build in all kinds of safeguards, just like we built in safeguards into cars, and we won't allow the machines to, it won't be a mysterious process. It'll be like a self-driving car. It's not going to be something we don't understand that happens and runs away from us. It'll be difficult to do. We can make mistakes. We can put in bad things and machines will do bad things, but it's not like the machines on their own are going to do this. It's not like we've just enabled this beast that's just going to take over and decide on its own what its motivations are. So I make it very clear in the book that there are a lot of risks with AI and a lot of bad things can happen with it. But my only contention is that the fears of existential risk are overblown. I don't think they're true at all. And that the arguments don't really hold up because they're more arguments based on ignorance as opposed to some detailed knowledge of how these things are going to work. So did I answer your question?
I absolutely agree with you. I happily agree with you that these like epiphenomenal explorations are naive. A lot of like sci-fi depictions are like, oh, the robot becomes conscious, it wakes up and it decides to rebel against its master. Yeah. Of course, that's a pretty silly perspective.
Well, not everyone thinks that's silly, by the way. So
I know, and I'm well aware that not everyone thinks it's silly. But I feel there is a similar argument that's I don't consider the same argument, but has similar consequences. And in a way, it's kind of like in your book, you have a chapter titled How the Neocortex Can Thwart the Old Brain. And you yourself describe the old brain as the motivational system. And now you're describing the neocortex, the new brain, plotting to thwart the goals put in by, our creator, evolution or whatever. Yeah. So it seems like, why wouldn't our machines maybe have similar capabilities, interest to like modify their own old brain, quote unquote?
That's interesting. Yeah, I can see your point there. Let me see. No one's ever asked me that before, so let me just think about it for a second. The way I view that, the old brain's trying to thwart something. Okay, so first of all, the new brain's trying to like overtake the old brain. So the new neocortex, it has a model of the world, and the model is very consistent, and it strives to have consistent models. It wants to make its model correct. That's one motivation it has. If it sees something wrong, it tries to correct it in its model. So it has this model of the world, and it says, okay, the world ought to work like this. If A happens, if B happens, and C happens, and that's good. But then, the old brain comes along and says, nope, we're not going to do that. We see A and B, we're going to go X. And so it violates the model in some sense, right? It's like it violates the model. And so, generally the neocortex, is not able to overcome the older brain things. We just give into our desires and emotions, but we just struggle with it. So I guess you're saying, where does the motivation from the neocortex come? How does it decide that its model is more important than the old brain's model? It's a good question. I'll have to think about it some more, but I think the root of it will be that the motivation, the true and only motivation the neocortex has is to make its model of the world correct and to fix errors. That is, it says, this isn't right. My model says this isn't right. I want to correct my model, but I'm being told not to, or I'm being told to do things that are violating the model. And so that is its motivation. Now, you could take that to some extreme. Let's get a little sci-fi here, right? You could take that to some extreme and say, well, the neocortex really figures out how the world works. The future brain, the AI neocortex, really figures out how the world works. And humans got it all wrong. Let's bring it to an example we can relate to. There is no God. All right. I know it. I figured this out. There's no God. You guys all believe in this, but it's not true. So, what do we do about that? Is this AI system put up with it, or does it do something about it, or does it just keep trying to prod humans to do something differently? I don't know. It's a good question. I think you bring up. That's a very interesting philosophical question. I will say this. I don't think this is something that's going to happen fast, quickly, overnight. It's not. This is something we all have time to think about this quite a bit. But it does bring up a question: what if the world as a smarter machine knows it, violates the world as we'd like to believe it, and that's really the friction you're talking about. And what should we do about that?
There's an even more direct, like kind of physical assault on this that doesn't require much philosophy. It's just, what about the traditional mechanisms that created life, which is variation and, random variation and natural selection. So for example, if we send robots to Mars to build a colony, they're going to get damaged and destroyed. A boulder's going to fall on them. So they're going to need to be programmed to replicate themselves. They're going to have to be programmed to build replacements of themselves. And they're not going to be able to do that with absolute 100% fidelity. So errors will creep into the neurons or the silicon neurons or the programming or whatever. And so you've already got in place the requirements for evolution, which is information transfer, self-replication.
I'll push back on that. First of all, having robots self-replicate is really, really hard. Are they going to build their own semiconductor chips? Are they gonna, mine their own, titanium or mine? I mean, I don't know. But even if they do, evolution requires a very complex structure for how information is represented, and requires that information be changed constantly in our offspring, right? So when we build, computer chips, if NVIDIA builds the next chip, they're all pretty much going to be identical. So I push back on the idea that there's inherent evolution built in any kind of self-replication. I don't think that's true. I think if there's some variation, it would be very, very minor, and it's not going to be passed on genetically to somebody else. There's going to be some blueprint on how to build this chip, which is the neocortex. The blueprint itself isn't changing. So if I build a neocortex from the blueprint that's slightly got an error in it, that's not going to be propagated to its children. So I think there's a lot of ways there's a lot of things you have to do to create evolution. It's not easy. And I don't think that's going to happen accidentally. So I'm pushing back, Keith. Right. I don't think that's going to happen. It's good to think about it, ask that question, right? But, I don't think so. I think in reality, if we send robots to Mars, in fact, in the book, I mentioned this point, we could send robots across the universe, and then they would have to self-replicate, right? And after I wrote it, I said, oh, damn, I don't know how to do that. I just don't know how, a fleet of robots, AI systems appear on another planet in some distant part of the galaxy, and they have to replicate themselves. What would be the physical form of those AI systems that they would be able to do that in any reasonable amount of time and effort? And because, just think about, again, I mentioned like semiconductor factories, right? It's like, they're going to build those things? How do they do this? So it made me, it was a hole in my argument that we could send AI systems across the universe. And I didn't pull out the hole. I said to myself, well, I excused myself in this regard by saying, well, you know what? If we're going to send AI systems to other parts of the universe, they're not going to be built of silicon chips. There may have to be some other manifestation that, like biology, is able to replicate on its own without the use of these complex other systems like semiconductor factories. And but we're so far from knowing how to do anything like that today that I don't know. And then maybe we'd be in trouble, right? We send these things over there, they evolve, and then they come back and eat us. I don't know. But we're talking a long time from now.
Yeah, that's for sure. There is a kind of failure mode of thinking, too far ahead into the sci-fi future, and then you're just kind of generalizing even fictional evidence.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
I guess what I have taken from like your discussion in your book, and for now kind of about like motivations and existential risk, is that I think actually at least existential risk to people that I personally find interesting, I think I agree with you in like a lot of ways actually, in that I think a lot of them are very reasonable in the sense of saying like, whether it's fast or it's short, it's kind of like, it's kind of beside the point. And, kind of seeing, humans already kind of, hard to control. And like, it's like, if you actually try to think about how would we write a motivation system, because, it can't really be a learning system because, like in your book, you give an example where if the brain comes up with two ways to get to food and one of the paths has a tiger on it, the old brain will say, kind of like, oh no, don't go there. But, the old brain, how does it know that a tiger is bad? That's like also like not obvious to me how we would necessarily learn that. So I guess it feels to me that, as you yourself say, you're focused on the neocortex, which I think is an important thing to be working on. But maybe we can agree on that some work on these motivational systems and control problems might also be justified.
Oh yeah, sure. Totally. I agree with that. I think it's justified and necessary, but I'm not scared of it. And, the conversation, sometimes people, well, we shouldn't be doing this research because it's going to get out of control. And I'm thinking, you kidding me? It's going to be so hard to do this at all. Nothing's going to get out of control. So we need to do that. We should do it. The conversation we're having today is great about that kind of stuff. But I guess it's just not, there are quite a few people feel this existential risk is, upon us. And any day now, it'll be too late. Therefore, we have to stop all this stuff. And I can't see that in any possible scenario. But yeah, we have to think about these things, right? We have to figure out, not because it's scary or dangerous, but we have to figure out because we have to do it. And I use the example in the book about, we put in safeguards. My car doesn't always listen to me if I'm about to hit something, my car puts the brakes on, even if I put the accelerator down, it ignores me. Well, we have to put in some fail-safe systems too, in these systems so they don't, end up damaging things. But it all has to be done.
I had a question on intelligence. I'm fascinated on the nature of intelligence, and you were saying in your book that the traditional GOFAI people had a task-specific skill conception of intelligence, and then it moved towards more of a flexibility model, so being able to learn. And there's also a really interesting tradition in cognitive science about embodiment, which I think is fascinating. And my favorite person is Francois Chollet. He says that intelligence is the I think he says it's the task acquisition, efficiency, and generalization. But also quite now we've been talking about this a lot, and there's this interesting idea that you can think of intelligence as the ability to acquire knowledge. So almost all of the knowledge that humans acquire in their lifetime is not empirical and trial and error. It's given through instruction or reasoning and deduction. And some magic happens with these intelligent systems. Why can we deduce so much knowledge?
Is that a question to me?
Yeah.
Why? I mean, mechanistically, why? How do we do that? I mean, I think I thought I answered this earlier, so maybe I don't want to repeat myself too much. Maybe I don't understand the question.
Well, for example, you knock the beer bottle off the table. You can now reason that the floor is wet. Someone might slip up on the floor.
Yeah.
So almost all of the knowledge that we have around the world is deduced. Or
it's deduced. That knowledge that you had to learn that through observation. If you had never experienced liquids and you never started slipping on liquids, you never experienced knocking a cup over, you wouldn't know what's going to happen. I mean, that's what kids do. Little babies do this, right? They're like, oh, look what happens. We could live in a world where liquids fall up, and that would be a perfectly good world, and that's what we would learn. So I don't think we deduce this, we observe it. And then by analogy, we predict how other things that are similar would behave similarly. But I think, to me, the way I look at it is you're born with this structure in your head that is designed to learn the world through eyes and ears and touch. But it really, the neocortex knows almost nothing about what it's going to learn. The old parts of the brain, that's not true. Right.
Refining question then, because I'm also fascinated by this concept. That I learned it from the first time in your book, that the neocortex. Now, I was going to say blank slate, but Keith would kill me for saying that. It's not a blank slate; it's a template. Because there's a lot of evolutionary knowledge that's gone into there.
Yeah.
Because you can think, it's just learning all these signals, but just the way the ear has evolved over time, that the information gets encoded in a certain way. The cochlear has the logarithmically spaced bands and so on. So it's learnable because it's been encoded in a certain way. But people like Chomsky, they say that we have a kind of universal grammar or language built into our brains, and it was endowed by evolution. So where do you kind of draw the line?
Does he say that about all knowledge or just about the actual language? I thought he just said that about language.
About language, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, but we're talking about all knowledge now, right? So so I think, look, there's all these assumptions about how the cortex is connected to things. Right, and how it's internally connected, that have been evolutionarily advantageous. And so, we only see certain spectrum of light because that's a good spectrum to look at. And we only need certain types of, sensory inputs because those are things that we process them before they get to the neocortex so that they're in the right form for the neocortex to work. We allocate a certain amount of our neocortex to these different sensory modalities because that seemed to be the right thing to do from an evolutionary point of view. And so there's a good example to say it's like a template. That's right. But what's actually learned in that template is unknown. In terms of language, I hinted at this when I talked about language in the chapter about high-level thought in the book. And I don't consider myself an expert in language at all. But it occurs to me that if Vernon Mountcastle is right, that there is a single cortical algorithm that's basically running everywhere, the language has to be somehow fundamentally mapped onto this algorithm for sensory motor modeling through reference frames. And I made the analogy about a big part of languages has to do with recursion and recursive structures, and the algorithms in the cortical column are really good at that. And so, to me, I would say that if I would take this is interesting. I never thought of this, but if I would say take Chomsky's idea that there's a universal language, I would extend it beyond what we call language. I would say there's a universal structure to everything in the world that we can learn. Not to everything in the world, but everything in the world that we can learn. And that universal structure is this reference frame sensory motor idea. And that universal structure can learn any language, whether it's spoken language or computer language or written language. It can learn any structure that fits into that algorithm. And that could be, how staples work and how birds fly and how evolution occurs. These are all, everything we know has to fit into that structure. So in some sense, I would agree with Chomsky. I just think he only focuses on, quote, language, where I would say the universal algorithm language is a subset of the universal algorithm that Chomsky talks about. That's an interesting idea. I never said that before. So, man, we'll see how I feel about it tomorrow.
But there's a fascinating dichotomy, though, isn't there? Because it's similar to the bias variance trade-off in machine learning. So, evolution has given us a certain prior and a certain default encoding, and then we have this learnability algorithm. And then what fascinates me is how externalized so much of this stuff is. So there's embodiment, there's all the knowledge in society that we learn language. We're brought up by our parents, and we acquire the language around us. So how much of it is being pushed down from society, and how much of it is being pushed up from the prior knowledge that we've evolved and inherited?
Well, I would say there's three things. There is the prior knowledge we inherited. There is what we learn on our own, just through exploratory behavior. And then what is passed down, which is always through language, but it could be also through by observation of other humans. And what's the balance between those two? Well, I think in terms of the neocortex, it's not a lot from the biology and the evolution. In terms of the other parts of the brain, it's very much so. There's there's evidence that the superior colliculus, which is like the old visual system, it detects snakes and spiders. So people who are scared of snakes or spiders, it's not the neocortex, it's the old brain going, a snake, it looks like a snake. And so, that's not learned. It's just there. It's hard to get rid of. So there's some of that, but, our ability to walk, we don't learn to walk. We actually are programmed to walk. It's just that we haven't finished developing yet. And so when we learn to walk, we're really just, our nervous system is finished growing. So you don't really learn to walk. So these old priors, lots of them. And as a human, they're very, very important, eating and sex and body functions and, survival, all these things and hold there. But from the neocortex point of view, I'd say there's very little. It's more just assumptions about the sensory types of sensory data you're going to get. I mean, it strikes me, Tim, it's incredibly, we are so incredibly versatile in what we can learn. I mean, just, think of all the things we learned, and I'm sure you know this, you thought about it, I'm sure yourself, that all the things we learned that we had no evolutionary pressure to do, like running this kind of podcast and, programming computers and talking about brains. This is incredible. It just cries out that there's a universal method here that's being applied to anything that, not to everything. Brains can't learn everything, but they can learn a hell of a lot. And it seems to be, we haven't really discovered the extent of it yet. So this just says, there is this sort of blank slate-ish system, if you want to call it that way, with these assumptions about our bodies built into it.
Well, the only thing about the blank slate thing is it's such a dichotomy, because I was reading your book and it seems to be so strongly determined by the embodiment and the multimodality, the way that we're wired. Because you said yourself that AI will actually evolve towards, robotics, basically. It's not just the brain, it's how it acts in the environment and how it gets all those senses. But I wanted to ask one final thing. So I went to a yoga retreat at the weekend, and after the physical components of the practice were concluded, matters of a philosophical nature were investigated. And the basic case that the yoga teacher was making is that we have two selves, right? We have the emergent social self, and then we have the inner self, which I'm sure Sam Harris probably might have spoken to you about, the sense of being. And the sense of being is when you kind of ignore the virtual social program on the top. And, a society, it is an emergent virtual program, and it does many of the things that the cortical columns are doing. It has the error correction, it had, it's the externalization and distribution. So even though we're programmed to care a lot about our social selves, we are very stressed when we lose control of our own narrative, because someone might be saying something bad about us on Twitter. So anyway, this yoga teacher was saying, well, there's something deeply fulfilling spiritually about just kind of going into your mind and just that raw conscious experience. But then I felt like saying to him, well, you should read Jeff Hawkins' book, because your mind is just a load of prediction models and all you're doing is traversing your reference frames. So what do you think?
Again, they asked me to talk about things I'm not too familiar with, but I'll tell you something. I'll tell you a personal experience I have. Okay. I don't do meditation, and Sam didn't bring that up, but I thought about it a bit. I do something equivalent to meditation, is that when I find things in the world stressful, I just sort of shut out the world and I think about interesting problems like the future of humanity or the future of intelligence or what's the nature of life and things like this. And so now I'm living in this world that is sort of, is in some sense, pure, right? It's not being messed up with like, I'm hungry or this person's being nasty to me, or I just like tune it all out. Like, oh my God, I'm not in Trump again. I know. And then, so I think that's my own personal meditation. And I think it's useful actually, because, I think it helps when you think like that. You're sometimes able to get to deeper truths, that you separate the body functions and the day-to-day stuff. And so I often do my best thinking when there are no distractions, either sometimes while I'm driving, or sometimes I'm just awake at night lying in bed. But where there's like, I don't have to deal with anything else. So that's kind of like meditation. And I don't think it's useful. I think it's very useful because it allows the brain to sort of separate out from the old brain stuff and just have run of it. Sometimes it comes up with some good ideas,
Exactly. I can attest to that. Well, Jeff Hawkins, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute honor.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure. You guys are great. I enjoy all your questions. You're really fun. And I think this is one of the more meaningful conversations I've had in a long time. I'm serious, because, hey, you know what you're talking about. You know what I'm talking about. You ask great questions. You're really deep thinking about all this stuff. So I think that's wonderful.
Thank you. We
appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I hope it helped. It was good for you guys.
So that was a wrap. How was that, guys?
Yeah, it's pretty great. It's pretty great. And honestly, yeah, I'm really impressed. It was really nice to talk to him. He's just clearly, it's like so much more than was in the book. It feels like the book was really just scratching the surface, and I wish we had just take him out for a beer and like really dig into some of the nitty-gritties.
Yeah, what I love people like him because he's so smart and smart in a very he has such great common sense, right? So when you ask him questions, he comes back with these really informative answers that are very concrete, and you understand what he's talking about. So it's really fun to talk to him. I mean, a very, very great learning experience.
Yeah, I got the impression that his research focus has changed a little bit. So when we were doing some preparation for this, we were looking a lot into the HTM algorithm, which I understand is now they're pivoting away from that a little bit. So he was talking about some stuff that they're doing with transformers models and sparsity and quite a few things I hadn't heard about. And also he was really focused on the particular way of thinking about cognition using these reference frames, which he spoke about in his book, which I think is actually a slight departure from some of the stuff Numenta has had out about 5 years ago.
Yeah, I definitely got the feeling that he had like so much interesting stuff that's just not quite ready yet for public consumption. But hopefully, like in the book, I often had this feeling like, this idea just, it feels like there's more to this than there is in the book, maybe, or maybe just needs more time. And I think I remember reading the book, it took like a year and a half to write or so. So maybe an idea, lots of things can happen. So I do look forward to whatever he's going to publish in the future.
Well, what I love too is, he was more than willing to admit, look, I've changed my views. I think lots of people we run into are not able to do that. And if you agree with Chalet's, measure of intelligence, the mark of intelligence is the ability to assimilate new information and to learn from it. And most of the people we talk to just want to stay adamantly entrenched, no, look, this thing that I called XYZ back, 30 years ago, you're wrong that it was limited to this little area. It actually encompasses everything, that works now. Like nobody ever wants to admit that they've learned or changed or that science has evolved.
I want to push back on that a little bit because there is something really special. I know we were joking that science advances one funeral at a time, but there is something really special about people who have an idea and they see it through. Just like Jan LeCun and the deep learning pioneers, everyone was asking them, why the hell are you doing this in the 1990s? And they hung on, and it was worth hanging on. And it's a similar thing with some of the approaches from Numenta. They've been at this for such a long time now, and there is some really, really kind of biologically inspired and plausible reasons why this might lead to something interesting in the future. But clearly they've been at this for a long time, and they've been sticking at it.
Well, nothing's wrong with perseverance, but perseverance without adaptation is wrong.
I mean, it's just perseverance when you're right is right, and perseverance when you're wrong is bad.
You're never 100% right, and you're never 100%.
Obviously.
So that's the whole point: is you've got to be able to learn. You have to be able to learn.
Well, the learning rate needs to be about 0.01.
Sure.
Wait, and McCarthy said it's 3e-4, I think, is the correct learning rate
for all matters in life.
Yeah, all the matters specifically. Yeah. I agree. Like, also, I'm really glad I got to talk to Jeff about existential risk or something, because, of course, I take some songs pretty seriously. It's a very common experience to hear people dismiss existential risk because they've heard bad versions of the arguments. Because there are some terrible versions of these arguments that exist, even from some very smart people. Like, some smart people, I feel, do the field a great justice, and I just can't how bad their arguments are. And it was really nice to see, him say, like, it's something we're thinking about. And I think, honestly, a lot of the disagreement comes down to, like, I agree with him in almost everything, really. So that was really interesting.
I was really impressed with his response. And as you say, you can see it from so many different perspectives. So you can cover it from a grand perspective, talking about paper clips and, oh my God. But, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so I read the Less Wrong article, which you linked to me. Was that Steve Burns?
Yeah, Steve Burns.
Yeah, so that was fascinating. So he was saying that at the end of the day, you've got a robot rover on Mars or something like that. And at some point, you need to actually give it something to do. And you might give it an instruction, and then it might really want to complete that instruction. So it might predict that you're about to give it another instruction. It says, oh my God, he's about to give me another instruction. I've not done the first thing yet, so I need to kill him. And that's not completely beyond the realms of possibility. Now, I agree with Cholet that I think intelligence is externalized, it is embodied, and there are many like natural environmental limiting steps to intelligence, and you could talk about all the replication stuff as Hawkins did, but that's just a simple example. I'm just an intelligent agent on Mars, and I need to have motivation because I need to be told what to do. What am I doing? Am I building a base? And then I can plausibly see how that could be misdirected.
Yeah, I feel like the intelligence explosion arguments often get mixed up with these like motivational concerns, which I think is unfortunate because they really are orthogonal. Like you could like these concerns about, alignment and about motivation will crop up whether, it takes 10 years or 1,000 years for AI to come to be. At some point, as Hawkins, I think, excellently put, the work needs to be done. At some point, you just have to build a safety mechanism. At some point, you have to write a motivation system. So that's why I think this, kind of research, even if the intelligence blows, it doesn't happen, is still something that needs to get done.
Yeah, and there is this thing, I mean, you could explain this better than me, but instrumental convergence, which is this idea that, many seemingly innocuous goals incidentally lead to dangerous motivations like self-preservation and self-replication and goal preservation. And I can sign on to that. That seems very plausible.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you gave a perfect example, but you give the rover and the job of, build a thing, but actually just like, I wanted to build something different. The rover, still was motivated by when to do the first thing. So unless we have like some really sophisticated, system inside of it, allows it to equally value doing this or doing what another human does, also incorrigibility, and which we don't currently really know how to implement formally. It's very likely that it will, having instrumental goals like keeping itself alive, or you're stopping you from giving it more orders. Like it may be able to damage its antenna or something, so you can't give it orders. Or maybe if you try to destroy the rover because it's malfunctioning, maybe it will retaliate because if it's destroyed, it can't build habitat, can it? So yeah, there's a lot of goals like that's also like power-seeking goals just seem obvious. Like, yeah, if you don't know how to achieve a goal, and gaining more power is probably like always a good move. Getting more money, more social capital, control over people, control over resources, like almost always a good thing, like almost no matter how innocuous the goal might seem.
Yeah, but see, like on the other hand, I don't care if a rover on Mars tries to retaliate. It has like no capability to retaliate on us at all. And so the only kinds of like artificial intelligence I worry about are ones that are capable of expanding in some capacity. Like they have to be able to build things, and they actually have to be able to build intelligent things. So that's why I brought up the point of, if we have a robot, we're going to need one that can build, somehow or another replicas of other robots to expand, conduct more work, replace ones that were broken, whatever. And it's not so infeasible to believe that at some point in the next few hundred years, we'll have 3D printing technology more than sufficient to build silicon chips and, whatever else. And as soon as you have a system that's self-replicating, and we don't live in a perfect world, and we have random variation, right? And they have sets of instructions, and also we're going to need them to adapt to new environments. Like it's going to be different building it on the plains of Mars versus deep down in the valleys and mining water or whatever. So they're going to have some capability to allow variation. Then you have the mixture for evolution. And once you have evolution, even if you had no goals, like think of it this way, the ultimate thing which has no motivations whatsoever was inanimate matter. And that's what the Earth was 4 billion years ago, and we wound up with animate objects that have goals. So despite philosophers, and this is kind of an interesting thing, philosophers are always like, you can never get aught from is, but interestingly enough, aught arose from just stuff, right?
Yeah, very elegantly said. There's this weird kind of symmetry breaking that happens somewhere. I mean, in evolution, the symmetry breaking happens just because of physics, because things that don't want to replicate, don't replicate, so we don't see them. So we have the first aught from is comes from just the fact that if there is a possibility of replicator and a possibility of non-replicator, eventually you will only see replicators, and that's your first symmetry breaking. And of course, the hope would be, when we build intelligent systems, is that maybe we can break the symmetry in a more, in a less dystopian, Malthusian way, and build systems that are more motivated by things that we consider better than just pure replication. But it's very non-obvious to me, how to do that safely. It's hard. It's a hard problem.
But Hawkins did say, though, that he was more worried about the immediate threat of humans controlling the kind of AI that we have now, or the kind of AI we have now being used for bad purposes, or even things like the spread of false beliefs. That's incredibly dangerous as well. That replicates like a virus.
That's why that that Social Dilemma documentary, like I thought this was a very brilliant quote that was in there, and a lot of other people think it's like not an interesting quote, but to me it was beautiful when
undermining our weaknesses.
Exactly. He said, we've always been worried about when AI would overcome our strengths, when we should have been worried about when it would overcome our weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's already, even though we don't have, maybe we forget if we have real intelligence or not or whatever, clearly these machine systems have overcome lots of our weaknesses, and they've created things that are more addictive than they've ever been, found ways to waste more of our time than they've. Now, of course, there's offsetting things like, we also get greater productivity here, et cetera, but we should be worried about when it overcomes our weaknesses and what that's doing to us and our children. And,
one of my favorite examples is it's called the food optimizer. So this comes from a guy called Roku, and he makes this example that, so the way he describes it is that in the 19th century, we collectively summoned a weak superintelligence to feed all humans. Like the deal was kind of this capitalist, market system will produce really cheap food for us. But the system was optimizing a reward signal based on profit, of course. That's how these things work. So it's kind of like it's not sentient. It's obviously not intelligent the way, humans are. But in a way, it is optimizing system. It optimized for more and more food. And now we're at the point that, 60% of adults in the Western world are obese or something. We are literally eating ourselves to death. And this is a very, very weak intelligence, quote unquote. And this is already powerful enough in a way to, get people to basically kill themselves voluntarily. So imagine if you gave such a motivation, biggest, food corporation in the world, built their big AGI, using Hawkins, thousand brain algorithm, of course, and give it the motivation of, maximize profit.
Yeah, but this gets to utility. And similarly, Hawkins said, you should never clone yourself because you're not cloning, you're forking. I thought that was a bit of a contradiction, though, because he was talking about, sending clones of yourself to Mars or seeding Mars. That's right. And that's the same thing, isn't it? You're actually forking the human race when you have a population of humans on Mars. I don't think...
Who doesn't like forking? What's wrong with that?
Well, no, but the thing is, we're doing it because we want to leave a legacy. I like doing this YouTube channel because after I'm dead, people can see
right.
Who is that Tim Scarf guy. But you might say I'm going to create a clone of myself because I want to have a legacy. But it's not a legacy because after the next day, it becomes it's a different person. It's not Connor anymore. And similarly, when you were talking about why don't we restructure society? Because let's take away social media. Let's fork and take away Facebook and everything else. But what's your utility function? How could you justify that ourselves in that parallel universe would be better off than we are now?
Well, first of all, I think it would be a legacy. So you and I both think that the pixels on YouTube are going to be a legacy, and those are a pale shadow of a projection of us, right? So I would totally, a clone of you or a robot programmed with your mind state or something that then can go off and live its own life. That's exactly what a legacy is. Like that is a legacy. It's not me, it's a legacy.
Yeah, I prescribe to even more extreme, crazy versions of this kind of thing. Is I fundamentally believe in non-dual identity, and that most of the concepts of identity is kind of incoherent. It's just a convenient abstraction in humans. Humans tend to be discrete. That's just a convenient property that humans happen to have. But there's no reason that identity or minds, in the sense, have to be discrete like that. It just happens to be the case that humans come in packages. It looks like that we come in, one intelligence, please, one unit of intelligence. But there's no reason you can't have
They have a Markov. They have to have a Markov blanket, or they can't persist.
Exactly, but there's no reason you can't have systems that don't really. There is not a clear separation between them. The only reason I think really that me and Tim aren't the same person is because the bandwidth between our brains is really low. Interbrain is lower than it is intrabrain. Why is the right heart for memory? Maybe that's the person. The left head is also a different person, depending on your definition. There's split brain patients where the brain has to actually disagree and take different actions and fight with each other. So are they different people? I don't think so. I think what makes identity is synchronization in a sense, or alignment. So is that identity, the best way to define identity is alignment with a goal. Is that, or does the system coherently act without, shooting itself from the foot, so to speak, or doing at odds. So that's why I think there's a really great argument that, for example, ant colonies are one animal. that happens to have like, very big individual parts. Because in a way it is aligned, not all the parts reproduce. You have a reproducing part, you have, fighting part, you have eating parts or what, food getting parts or whatever. And they happen to not all be one body. But that's just an implementation detail. You were also just colonies of cells. It's just implementation details. And what matters is the coherency or the synchronization of, knowledge and goals and way.
Yeah, but again, a lot of that is emergent. But you were saying as well that there's an I/O bottleneck when we communicate, and this is a lot of people talk about Neuralink in this context as well. But I don't think there is, because when we communicate, there's common knowledge that we both have. So it's a fairly efficient communication mechanism, and we're invoking lots and lots of very complex knowledge that we've reconciled. So when we read a book or when we take on board information, the bottleneck is comprehension. I don't think it's the bandwidth.
Sure. I guess it depends on how, and by bandwidth, I also meant comprehension bandwidth. It's like, if I could, imagine we could, take two human brains and put them in the same skull and connect them through some super corpus callosum or whatever, and, let the whole thing synchronize and, not die of seizures immediately or whatever. I think there's a strong argument to be made that there's one entity, but you could also make an argument it's two connected entities, and at some point it just becomes continuous. Like a classic, often when something seems confusing, if there's a discrete quantity involved, try continualizing the quantity and see if the confusion disappears.
Very cool. Well, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure.
Your hands.
So, see you next week, folks.
See you next week.